Ladies and gentlemen, I read a book many, many years ago as a Christian apologist, Jesus Among Other Gods by Ravi Zacharias. And I was a big follower of these apologists, William Lane Craig, Ravi Zacharias, recognizing that there are no other gods that compare to Jesus. In fact, Jesus is so unique and no other gods are actually even on par. So my investigation and journey over the years of leaving Christianity and realizing that actually isn't the case. We're going to be showing you today other people, other deities, other demigods or humans that become divine, comparing Jesus to other Mediterranean figures. And who knows where this will take us. So I hope that you'll stay tuned. I guarantee you will learn something that you have never heard before. Welcome to MythVision. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are about to show you the gods. Camille Gregor is one of the deities that we have today that wants to tell you how much better he is than Jesus. And Derek Bennett, of course, I don't even need to introduce. Bennett has been a divine figure for quite some time. Welcome to MythVision, gentlemen.
Hi, how's it going?
He even has a voice of a god.
Real happy to be here. Real happy.
Yeah, it's been a while. We have to do this more often.
You're telling me it's hard to get you on the schedule, man, but we're here.
Hey, I've got 2 kids.
I've got 3.
I like you guys, and I'm not certain it's completely platonic either. I just don't know. I'm agnostic about that.
Derek, I'm picking up the vibes. I hope everybody watching today. I hope everybody watching today stays tuned because you guys have done quite a bit of research. In fact, it was Camille who tipped me over the edge from being full-on hardcore mythicist to, whoa, hold on, there's something more I need to investigate here that led me down a different path. Derek Bennett, you've been doing presentations of comparative deities, the evolution of resurrection, recently on Egyptian influence on the Bible. You're just all over the place with some really fun stuff. So what kind of treat do you have in store for us today, gentlemen?
Well, I mean, let me start. I was just thinking the other day, what is it that we actually mean when we say that Jesus was raised from the dead, And I think the key insight that I want people to understand and to get out of this video is that it doesn't really mean like revivification or resuscitation. So what happened to Jesus in the Gospels or in the New Testament isn't really in the same category as what happened, for example, to Lazarus or Jairus' daughter. So, Jesus didn't go on to, settle down, have kids, and then die. So it's not in the same category as the kids in Africa that Craig Keener thinks he can prove were actually raised from the dead using medical evidence. But what the claim is, instead, is that Jesus didn't die and go through the quote-unquote normal afterlife that ordinary people go through, but instead he was taken from the earthly realm of ordinary people to a divine realm where his status within like a metaphysical hierarchy of the world was elevated compared to ordinary people, and now he continues to exist as a divine being and he deserves worship. And I think this is a really key insight, because if you stop thinking about the resurrection as just reviving a corpse, and you start thinking about the resurrection in this way, then it turns out that this specific concept was actually really common in the ancient Mediterranean world, which is specifically the region and specifically the period in human history where the belief in Jesus' resurrection originates from. And then, it's just a social construct, right? Like all of these different stories. And what I would like to, I would hope we can do today is just go through what we exactly mean by this, and then maybe show some examples of other figures that are in the same category when it comes to this divine translation as Jesus. So does it make sense?
Yeah. This is something that I've been saying on MythVision for quite some time. If you're a new viewer, welcome. You will learn something. But I've had to broaden my understanding, thinking Christianity was just this religion that was literally wholly separate, as me and Derek Bennett always say, from all the religions around it, all of the, and the term religion itself is a problem. But my point is like the different culture, the different groups of people with different ideas, factions, etc. Christianity was this unique, wholly separate thing that had no influence from the outside world, and how false and wrong that really is. And if we did start realizing, as like works by John Kloppenborg, who shows these social groups, different working groups that have different trades and things are passing around. They're part of different cultic practices and things like that. They're part of little social groups, and they learn from each other. Christianity has a lot that looks like these other types of groups, from baptism to burial practices, things that you might see in the Mediterranean world and go, whoa, what is this? And so we're going to see and highlight these comparisons, but specifically focusing on the translating of people from the mortal realm, the earthly realm, to the divine realm, and then maybe even touch on apotheosis, resurrection, all of this fun stuff. Do you want to add anything to that?
I want to second what Camille said, that you cannot think of, when we're talking about the resurrection of Jesus, as the mere revivification of his old corpse back into a regular life of taking up fishing again in Galilee. That's not what we're dealing with here. It is equally a deification and apotheosis. He is raised to become a god, and in the earliest strata of New Testament texts, that is equally an exaltation to the heavens. So resurrection and exaltation appear to have been a synonymous event. That's what resurrection was being raised up as a god and placed in the heavens, where one could appear to their followers here on earth, in epiphanies or theophanies or whatnot. If I could point you to two books that will change the way you view all of this. M. David Litwa's Jesus Dios, the early Christian depiction of Jesus as a Mediterranean god, and A.W. Zweep's the Messiah in Lucan Christology, I think is the title of it. I might be botching that, but yeah, what Camille says is on point. The resurrection of Jesus, it's not just, hey, we're back in this world, same as it ever was. It's something much different from that.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting to point out, like, there are these pre-Pauline creeds that are embedded in Paul's authentic letters, and probably two of the most famous ones, and definitely the two that are the most relevant to the resurrection, is 1 Corinthians 15 and Philippians 2, right? And it's actually interesting if you think about it. Philippians 2, it mentions Jesus's suffering here on earth in a human form, and then it mentions his death on the cross, and then it goes on to describe his heavenly exaltation and him receiving a divine name, theonomy, right, which is again relatively common in the ancient Mediterranean world. But interestingly enough, the creed never mentions Jesus's resurrection, right? So it never says, okay, Jesus died on the cross, then he was raised, and then he was exalted in heaven. And then if you look at the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, it says Jesus died, he was buried, and then he was raised, according to the scriptures, and that's it. It doesn't specify, or it doesn't go on to say that Jesus was then exalted. And what explains why is it that we have these two creeds, and one is missing the exaltation and the other one is missing the resurrection? Like, the really good explanation is that it's actually describing the same thing, right? It's just the 1 Corinthians 15 creed gives you the terminology, it gives you he was raised, so that's the label that Christians applied to the concept. And then Philippians 2, it actually gives you what it means. And this isn't original to us, right? But there have been a lot of scholars writing about resurrection who point out that definitely for Paul and for a lot of early Christians, what it meant to say that Jesus was raised, and what it means for even Christians after Jesus to be raised in the future, is exactly this, right? This divine translation. And when Christians today kind of think about the whole process as having several specific, clearly delimited steps. So first Jesus was dead, then he was alive, walking around, appearing to people for a while, and then he ascended to heaven, and that's it, right? And then afterwards he only appears in visions or from heaven, like to Stephen. That only comes in the book of Acts. So that's a relatively late development, early 2nd century development, right? So yeah,
I like what you're saying. I like what you're saying here, that to be raised is to be glorified, or to be ascended, if you will, to completely be put into the Son of God place, as Philippians 2 or Romans 1:4 would say. He becomes a son of God by his resurrection, his being taken up. Because many people think in resurrection, they just take this to be this corpse that gets revivified. But this ascension thing is just, that's not the thing. The thing is he rose in his body, right? This is the emphasis Christians want to try and paint. But I like the way you're describing this and giving us emphasis on focusing on that, being translated and taken to the divine realm was what they're implying here. That doesn't mean that they didn't think of Jesus's body in some sense still existing. Jesus Deus actually describes this and points out. And then Derek Bennett, you've done this before in describing, Hercules burns on a pyre, but then he goes on to carry on having family in, Olympus. So he's like in the heavenly place, carrying on having kids and things like that. So as John Dominic Crossan said, in the ancient world, they would imagine the person existed with some kind of body, something, because they had to recognize them. They'd go into Hades and they'd notice who they were. Now imagine if you saw, you'd have to recognize them somehow. So they imagine they had some type of existence or body to know who they were, what they looked like. Now, I'm not going to get lost into the Emmaus Road story and how they didn't recognize Jesus here on earth. That's a whole nother discussion. But the point is like, you could see how the development would have happened. People are already going, oh, that's a ghost, or that's this and that. No. He even ate fish, So there's embellishments on Jesus' narrative that develop, I imagine, as an apologetic. But in some sense, would you agree with that, Camille? I mean, that.
Yeah, I think that there is an important clarification that needs to be made, right? So when the New Testament says that Jesus was raised from the dead, it uses like specific Greek verbs that are proprietary for Christians, right? So it uses like agero, for example, anistemi, that just means to awaken or to stand up. And these weren't the exact verbs that were used in Greek and Roman sources. There was a different terminology being used. So it's called theosis, apotheosis, deificatio in Latin, right? Immortalization, ascension, and stuff like that. What's important is that the concept is the same, right? And the reason why early Christians use this specific verb is because it's also Jewish. And in Judaism, there was this existing concept of people being resurrected at the end of the age, which, for example, in Paul's mind was just about to happen, right? The Greeks also had the concept of a resurrection that used the same terminology that Christians later use, like Xenophanes, for example, in the 4th century already has people being raised. But that usually meant revivification in the Greek context, right? And I think this specific terminology that comes from Judaism is probably a reason why a lot of the New Testament scholars have missed this kind of connection, right? Because when you are a New Testament scholar and you are doing a research into how people thought and what was their religious landscape, you start by isolating the specific words, and then you look into where the same term is used elsewhere in the surviving literature, right? And this is, for example, what Cook did. He has a really good book. It's called Empty Tomb, Apotheosis, and something, where he basically goes through the entire Greek surviving literature, and he looks for these specific terms, right? And because he's looking for the terms that are proprietary to Christians, he is getting some instances of resurrections which are actually revivifications, and he's kind of conflating them with what's being said about Jesus. But more importantly, he's missing a lot of the cases of divine translation just because a different verb was used. So it's more important to look at similarity in the actual concept than to look at similarity in the terms of what specific verbiage is being used.
Mm. That's a great point. I mean, where Derek Bennett lives in Kentucky, isn't it Kentucky, Derek?
Yes, sir.
They might say something in the South quite differently than someone in other regions of the United States. They're all trying to get to the same. They're trying to get to the same conclusion. They mean the same thing at the end of the day. It's just how they say it will be totally different. And I wonder if this plays a role in what you're trying to kind of describe. If you're coming out of Judeo-Hellenized Jewish kind of Jewish movement initially, you just use different verbiage to describe these things. But you notice even in Josephus and in Philo, right, Hellenistic Jews, they have, like anyone who's read their Bible, forget Philo and Josephus for a moment, they read about Moses. Moses died. I mean, Moses literally gets buried somewhere. We don't know where, but he gets buried. Well, I know there's probably some propagandistic reasons why Philo and Josephus would want to defend, Judaism, and they have people like against Appian and such. They're trying to defend their version of, but they have Moses have this ascension, and they're mimicking the world in which they live, but also trying to combat it and show why their laws are older and better, or whatever the reasons may be. I imagine this kind of cooperation happens even within the Christian literature, and they may be using certain language, but it's adopting the concepts with the different language.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting, because Josephus, who writes in the first century, he is of course very Hellenized, right? So it's interesting to see how he's rewriting these stories, and he's basically rewriting them into stories of divine translation, right? So he is using the Septuagint that's already in Greek as his source, but he doesn't take the specific vocabulary from the Septuagint. Instead, he words it differently so that it then becomes a story of divine translation, right? So he, for example, says that Enoch returned to the divinity, which implies pre-existence of Enoch, which is interesting. And yeah, as you mentioned, in Josephus, Moses never dies. So Josephus says that Moses wrote in the Deuteronomy that he died, but that's not actually what happened, right? What actually happened is that a cloud descended from heaven, enveloped him, and he disappeared. And the verb that Josephus uses, aphanizo, is exactly the verb that is very standard in these Greek translation stories, right? And he uses the same verb for Elijah and for Enoch as well. So in Josephus's mind, these figures are translated essentially. And of course, in the Second Temple period literature, we have Enoch being angelified, right? So he becomes Metatron, a divine being in First Enoch. Third Enoch calls him a lesser Yahweh. So if you think that Jews were monotheists, well, they had at least two Yahwehs, apparently.
I like that. Acts chapter 1 seems to imply when Jesus ascends, he gets taken in by a cloud,
Yeah, and this is a really interesting point, right? Because these stories are so similar that you can even see these specific beats that are being hit. And Jesus being enveloped by a cloud, or he disappearing in a cloud, that has to do with like a very specific way in which people in the ancient world depicted becoming invisible. Because when you, for example, when you see the movie Clash of the Titans in the 70s, where Perseus is wearing the cape of Hades, right? The way how it's depicted today in movies is that your eyes no longer register him. So maybe you can see his footsteps, but he becomes invisible. But actually, in the ancient world, that's not how people did it. So the way how to depict Perseus becoming invisible in the primary sources in the ancient literature is not that he's no longer being registered by human eyes. It's that he's enveloped in a cloud so that he's no longer visible, right? So if you are a Greek or Roman author and you want to signalize that someone is invisible, you always depict some kind of cloud that prevents people. It's like obstructs vision, right? And that's the way how to do it. It's, for example, in the Ascension of Romulus. So he's enveloped by a cloud. Mm-hmm. I think it's in an account of Heracles, his ascension, but I would have to check the primary sources. And it's, of course, in the Ascension of Jesus, right? So it's really interesting that it's hitting these very specific ways how to conceptualize it, right?
Wow.
And of course, like if you are a Christian apologist and you are committed to thinking that at some point, like Jesus's body literally floated up, then it's not going to be implausible that at some point he would like float so high that he basically passes through the cloud layer, right? But then it just becomes a really weird coincidence that this is also how like all of these other literary sources that depict pretty much the same concept decide to do it artistically, right?
And you could see, and I want to have Derek give us his thoughts on this, is like you could see how someone who finally realizes, a fundamentalist, let's say, who's willing to go and follow the reality of what is the case, who finds that there are other figures that predate this account in the New Testament, and of course contemporaneous and post-date, that have the same thing going on with their guys. How that right there, for someone who's open-minded, could start going, man, why am I special pleading? Why is this one the real one and all the other ones are fake? This seems to be a common trope. It seems to be something that's going on.
Yeah, and it's also important to realize that there are differences between these cases, right? So, of course, you can pick the specific features of the Jesus story that are going to be unique, but that's also true about any other case. Right, like some are more similar than others, but there are specificities that they have to do with circumstances of the story. So how many people are involved? There is different motivation. So why the person is ascends to heaven, and you can even classify these different cases based on these kinds of features. And then there are, let's say, cultural specifics. So just like, for example, it's specific to this Jewish version that it's called resurrection, you can find Egyptian features that are only present in Egyptian sources, or in cases of where Greeks or Greek-speaking Egyptians are retelling these stories. So, for example, in Greek retellings of the mythology of Osiris, Isis, and Horus, Isis gives Horus a drug which immortalizes him. So it revives him, and also he becomes immortal. And that's like a specific feature of this version because it comes from Egyptian mythology, right? There are other instances where people are immortalized because they eat divine food. That was actually a very common trope in antiquity. You have nectar and ambrosia in Greek mythology. You have, of course, the tree of eternal life in the Garden of Eden, right? Like if they picked from a different tree, we wouldn't know good and evil, but we would be immortal because that's the tree that immortalizes you, right? So yeah, we have Babylonian examples. Like there was a Hellenistic historian called Berosus, who was a priest of Baal in Babylon. He was Hellenized, and he wrote Near Eastern history in Greek. So he's basically what Josephus was to the Jews and what the author of Luke Acts was to Christians, or Manetho to Egyptians. And he has this account of a Sumerian king It was the last king before the flood, and he's actually like a Noah figure because he builds an ark and he survives the flood. And in this Hellenized version of the story, after the ark lands and the people get off the ark, he disappears, and then there is a voice from heaven that gives the survivors religious instruction, and it's like his voice coming from heaven because he, ascended. So, yeah, Jesus is special, but everyone is special, and when everyone is special, nobody is special.
Derek, you're special. Tell us what you think.
Oh, stop it. Yeah, it's I would definitely, along the lines of what Camille's talking about, check out Richard C. Miller's, of course, his book Resurrection and Reception in Early Christianity, but especially he does have an article which you can find, I believe, on academia.edu, which is Mark's Empty Tomb and Other Translation Fables in Classical Antiquity, which Camille brought up on Apologia's podcast, which was excellent. If you haven't seen that, check it out. But Dr. Miller points out how much the Gospels really do follow in the tradition of Romulus. I mean, he says it's right square in the tradition of Romulus, and that's regardless of whether Romulus is actually said to have died in these tales. The apotheosis, the deification, and the various signs and portents that we have presented there, he lists off one after another of the coincidences or parallels that are present there. And it's the cumulative case is such that you can't deny that this is very much following in the tradition of Romulus. And I would add that, as I pointed out in my recent video on my channel, that there was additionally or alternatively a tradition in which Romulus did die and must have been raised, as Cicero says, Proculus Julius, he appeared to Proculus Julius walking after his decease. So there were alternative traditions, some in which Romulus did die and was raised, others in which he was raised or translated while alive. You have this kind of diversity, so to speak, in all of these different religious traditions. Scripturally, in terms of what we're talking about, we see this Ephesians is a little later than Paul's authentic letters, dating from, I think, around, I think most scholars traditionally dated around 70 CE or so, but very explicitly talks about the mighty strength God exerted when he raised Christ from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly realm. I mean, it's almost just explicit in how vividly it portrays that this is a scenario in which he's raised from the dead and placed on the throne in the heavens with God and at his right hand. And then let's not forget that this is equally resurrection was also deification here, as Romans 1:4, which probably has, I think, an earlier creedal heritage, says that Christ was appointed the Son of God in power by his resurrection from the dead. So yeah, it's everything Camille's talking about is just right on point here. The resurrection of Christ is equal parts exaltation and deification, and this very much falls within the tradition of not just Romulus, but various other divinities from that time and place in the wider Greco-Roman world, in the wider Mediterranean world, even in ancient Egypt. When Camille talks about conceptually, even if it's not the exact same words that are being used, conceptually in ancient Egypt, as Jan Osman, Egyptologist, tells us, the whole raise thyself litany in the pyramid texts and so forth, that this is resurrection, because what it meant was to get up and ascend to heaven. That's what, agiro or anistemi, that's what they convey, is you're getting up, you're moving upright into an upright position from having been lying down, dead, and then being taken up. So, and there might be something of a genealogical connection between what's going on there in ancient Egypt and what's going on in the Greco-Roman world. As I pointed out in my video on the Egyptian origins of the Bible, Eliezer Gonzalez, the traditional Egyptian antecedents of post-mortem ascent, he talks about there's very likely a continuing kind of tradition between ancient Egyptians and ancient Greeks, this concept of being raised up alive again, and becoming a god, and being exalted into the heavens. So this is just fascinating stuff with what appears to be a very long, rich cultural heritage and syncretism between adjacent cultures.
I think this is, you guys should have slapped me by now. I can't believe we haven't offered everyone a way of becoming deified. There's a way to become deified, and that is to go and subscribe to Atheologica's YouTube channel. That is Derek Bennett, the gentleman who just spoke. He has an Egyptian video right now, the monumental impact of ancient Egypt on the Bible. Absolute must go watch, one of the best right now on his channel. And then Cam and Camille, or Cam and Cam, go check out his YouTube channel. A lot of the stuff he's doing is anti-apologetic in a sense. So you can actually learn quite a bit from him on how to engage with bad apologetics. There's a lot of good stuff there. I also have a Patreon. Go join us. And Derek Bennett has a Patreon. If you want to help see more, you can check out, get all the fun, nice thumbnails and stuff that he has, and personally harass him there. So there you have it. Please. I forgot. It was wrong of me not to at least give people an option to become deified. Camille, I know you have something you want to add to this, or to carry us into comparisons more and more.
Yeah, just like Derek mentioned, there is the question, for example, whether Romulus dies or doesn't die, right? That's beside the point, because as I mentioned, there are differences. What we are talking about is just the idea that you are taken from Earth to the presence of the gods. Then there you attain some kind of highly elevated position. Then you continue to exist as a divine being, unlike ordinary people who, go through the normal life cycle and then go through their appropriate afterlife. And then, some of these figures are mythological, some of them are historical, some of these figures disappear while they are still alive, and some of them die and then they are taken to the divine realm, right? Which means that in many cases, their corpse actually disappears from Earth, just like Jesus is, right? And actually, in ancient literature, one of the ways how to signalize that someone was a divine being was to show that they either themselves disappeared or their corpse disappeared after their death. Because this wasn't necessarily a spiritual thing, this was very much often physical thing, right? So you went up to heaven in your body. Sometimes, in some of these cases, there was a metamorphosis involved. So some people were believed to be transformed into animals, for example, and they became like divine beings that were also animals, because that exists, right? Like, just you can have essentially humans or humanoids who are gods. There are divine animals that are like helpers, for example. They take souls to the afterlife and stuff like that. What's also important to mention is that some of these people are basically transformed into divine beings, so they are divinized. This is something that Paul is talking about when he describes how our resurrected bodies are going to be transformed, right? It's, again, classical Greek transmutation. The substance that makes up your body is changed into more refined, more deified substance, so that you can then live in some kind of transformed divine realm, right? But Other examples are actually divine in some sense. So either they are sons and daughters of gods, or they are actually incarnations of divine beings who pre-existed before their human birth, right? What's also interesting detail is that usually these people are depicted as ascending to heaven, because that's where the gods are, right? And we don't mean some kind of like parallel universe or alternate dimension.
It's
no,
up
that
there.
was up. Yeah, up that way. You could go there in a rocket in the ancient world, right?
Yeah.
But in some cases, these people are taken to other environments where gods also live. And apart from heaven, it's usually associated with water. So they either become sea gods who live in the sea, or they disappear into rivers and they are river gods. That's also very common. And as you can see, that gets more different from Jesus, right? Jesus isn't a river god, but still, like the concept is similar. And in some cases, then there are like similarities which are like cherries on top. In some cases, this process is actually foretold by a prophecy. So the person in question knows in advance that this is going to happen. Heracles, for example, receives a prophecy that he's going to ascend to godhood, right? In some cases, the elevation, I've already mentioned that, is associated with getting a divine name. So, for example, when wife of Caesar Augustus, Livia, dies, she's deified, and she is actually worshipped as a goddess. I can't recall the name right now. I would have to look it up. But she basically gets a divine name. Guess who gets a divine name? Jesus, right? In Philippians 2, in the hymn,
his name above every
above every name. You know what the name is, right? Which is the name that Jesus gets when he is exalted? What is the name?
I don't know. What is the name? I thought it
Kyrios.
Christ.
No, Kyrios, Lord.
Kyrios. Lord. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know why Jesus is given this name?
Huh.
So, and again, this is a similarity, right? So when you look at these instances of theonymy, it's usually like the reason why the people are given the name, where their name changes, or why they get additional name, is because they are syncretized with other deities. So, for example, Romulus becomes a god Quirinus, but Quirinus was probably a deity that already existed in Rome and was worshipped, and the one just fused together, right? And there are other examples from Greece and stuff like that. And this is kind of similar with Jesus, because the reason why Jesus is given the title or name Kyrios is because in the Old Testament, it says in several places specifically that atonement can only be granted by Kyrios, by the Lord. This is in the Septuagint, Yahweh is translated as Kyrios, Lord, right? But then if you are a Christian, you have a problem, because how can Jesus provide atonement if it says that only Kyrios can do it? Well, you solve it by this process of theonymy, right? Jesus is given the name, so he can now become the agent of salvation. Because that's like the prerogative or the function that is associated with the name. And if you actually notice that in Paul, for example, Paul never calls God the Father Kyrios. That's a title that is only given to Jesus. And this is kept consistent across many Christian authors all the way into like 3rd century. When they talk about God the Father and when they talk about Jesus, they are often very careful to distinguish between one God, the Father, and Jesus Christ, the Lord. That's the logic, right? That Jesus was basically given this name so that he can function as this agent of salvation. And what was previously said about a different divine being is now retroactively applied to him. Yeah. So some other similarities is, of course, that some of the people, not all of them, some of the translated people, then like return for a period of time to interact with people, with humans, either to tell them what actually happened. So, for example, Romulus very famously appears to Proclus, and he actually announces his deification. Sometimes these people give some kind of instruction even ethical instruction, like go worship the gods. It's really important. I'm telling you to do that. Or reveal other information. Sometimes they, for example, fight in battles. So if you have a battle, you can get help from heaven by this divine being appearing and like physically killing people, and then they disappear. And of course, in these translation stories, there is usually the element of it describes what kind of cultic and ritualistic practices were instituted in order to worship this divine being, right? Because these divine beings are always worthy of worship, and it's appropriate for humans to do that. So just like you have the Eucharist, for example, in early Christianity, you have, for example, secret precincts set up for these divine beings. You have a priest established. Apollonius of Tyana gets a divine precinct. He gets priests. He has temples, or at least one, and so on, right? So these are just some additional similarities.
Derek?
Yeah, something else worth pointing out, like in the creed or the hymn in Philippians 2, what we're presented with is a case in which Christ is already divine and pre-existent. He becomes incarnate here on earth, and then he is raised and exalted. It's as if he was already divine. In becoming incarnate, he humbles himself, becoming like a son of man, like a man actually, and then is raised up to an even more divinely exalted status. That this is not completely unique in Christianity. You have this, for instance, with Asclepius. He was already divine in some sense. He dies and then is exalted to an even greater divine status. As Ovid says in Metamorphoses, from a god, you will become a bloodless corpse. And then you were transformed from a god to a bloodless corpse, and then to a god who was a corpse. And so twice renew your fate. He was already divine. He is struck dead by Zeus, and then he becomes a god again by being raised to life as a living deity, who is, of course, able to appear to his followers on earth, not just in dream visions, but actually physically, as Celsus says, Greeks and barbarians alike see no mere phantom, but Asclepius himself, healing, doing good, and predicting the future. That's actually corroborated by others like Maximus of Tyre, who says, I have seen Asclepius, and that not in a dream. We have this elsewhere. And with Romulus, as Plutarch tells us, he depicts Romulus telling Proculus that I had dwelt among the gods, and I was only meant to dwell among you here for a short time, after which I would return to heaven again. So you still have this isn't entirely unique in Christianity, where they're already divine. They have an earthly incarnation, sometimes experience a suffering and death, and are raised up again to an even higher exalted status. We have the same kind of thing in terms of theosis or divinization. We have that happening for Christians in the New Testament. They become sons of God themselves, as First Thessalonians 4 tells us. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. This is not just an earthly dwelling, same as it ever was. They're actually being taken up as sons of God themselves. And the whole business in 1 Corinthians 15, where it talks about we are endowed with spiritual bodies, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. Christian apologists like to twist and distort this and try to make something else of what it plainly says here. We're given new spiritual divine bodies. That's what's happening here. And it's not flesh and blood or flesh and bone like you see in Luke. The way they try to combat this is, for instance, William Lane Craig says that the whole flesh and blood term that's being used here, this is synecdoche. It's, where you have a part or parts standing in for the whole. It doesn't really mean flesh and blood because it means more than that. Well, of course it means more than that. Flesh and blood, it's a stand-in for bodily corporeality and corruptibility, precisely because it is flesh and blood. Another example of synecdoche would be like all hands on deck, right? Well, they don't mean that only your hands are going to come scurrying up to the deck. You're bringing your whole body with you, right? But in bringing your whole body with you, are you not also bringing your hands? In other words, that's a critical component of, what's true of the whole must be true of the part. So when he says flesh and blood, sure, he means more than just flesh and blood, but he doesn't mean the opposite of flesh and blood. So he is talking about a flesh and blood body that is composed of actual flesh and blood. And that's not what we're going to have. We're going to have something completely different, a body no less, sure, but not one, not a natural body like we have now. We're going to become spiritually embodied divine beings, just as Christ had been.
Yeah, this is where we get from the idea that there are like specific individuals in these ancient sources that go through this process, to the idea that actually this is an option that's available for ordinary people, right? And there is actually a development that we can see in the ancient world where originally this divine translation is reserved only for very special people. Usually you had to be a son or a daughter of a god in order to go through this process, like Heracles, for example, or even Romulus, right? But then somewhere in the Greek archaic period, we start getting alternative religious movements that actually start telling people, it's not the case that there is this massive gap, massive chasm between you ordinary people and the gods and their progeny. It's actually the case that there is a divine spark in every human, and if you do certain things, that divine spark can escape the mortal flesh and it can rejoin the gods, right? A very old movement, at least in the Greek world, is Orphism, where Orphics had this account of how baby Dionysus was eaten by the Titans. The Titans were smitten as a punishment, and then from the ash of their corpse, humans were formed. And the point of the myth is that every human is a mixture of the Titans, who are like sinful and they represent the world of the flesh that you're supposed to escape. But also in you and in every individual is a part of Dionysus, because the Titans devoured him, right? So you have, like, your being has a component of divinity. And if you are initiated into this religious movement, that divine spark can actually return to its rightful place in the divine realm, right? Yeah.
This is a great point. I just want to point out that this is going to sound funny, but to all my skeptics in the audience, hear me out. There are fundamentalist Christians who read Genesis. They read this situation that goes on early on in Genesis. They see later on Israel's combating the Amalekites and other groups. And I've heard them make the excuse to get around the ugliness of the literature, because the Hebrew Bible is loaded with violence and genocide and things like this. And they point out, probably somewhat correctly, according to the lore and the mythology, but you can see why they draw this conclusion. They say, these aren't like complete innocent other groups. These groups are descendants of the sons of God in Genesis 6, or there's some fallen angels come down and they sleep with the women, right? So now you have the divine and the mortal, and this wickedness that we see why God floods the earth. It happens again after the flood, where these humans are now these kind of mixture of these evil beings, these fallen or these sons of God with the women, and they end up having these extremely wicked hearts. So they believe they're like these divine / human beings, but they're wicked. They're more evil than just normal humans, right? Like some regular mortals or something to this effect. I don't know how accurate that portrayal is, but what you just described with the Titans and being part divine, part complete wicked, and here are humans, they're kind of like saying this is the case. This is why God commands the Israelites to really wipe these bad people off of the face of the earth.
Yeah, well, I mean, the point was to show that that there is this dualism introduced at some point, and the idea that, well, basically this divine translation becomes democratized, right? It's not just for the aristocrats who trace their lineage back to the gods. Now everyone can be translated if you jump through certain hoops, right? And of course, in Christianity, the hoops that you have to jump through in order to get this is to pledge your devotion to this deity, right? Near Eastern deity. He was the first fruit. He went through the process first. And if you have pistis, if you are loyal to him, then you can achieve the same status, right? Like Paul says, you are going to judge angels. So that's a very high exaltation in the heavenly hierarchy, right? And this isn't this isn't completely unprecedented in like a Hellenistic Jewish thought, because I don't know if you remember, but in Genesis 15, Abraham is promised that his descendant, his seed, is going to be like the stars. And of course, the normal interpretation, which is probably what was intended by the author, is that they are going to be there's going to be a lot of them, right? The population is going to multiply, and that's how you get rewarded as like an early Iron Age patriarch. You die, you go to Sheol, but the reward is that your progeny is going to be very successful. They are not going to be wiped out by other nations and stuff like that. But actually, in Hellenistic Second Temple Judaism, in a number of texts, like in Philo, in Sirach, in the Apocalypse of Abraham, the idea that Abraham's progeny is going to be like the stars was reinterpreted into Catasterism, right? And Catasterism is a specific type of translation where you become a star or a different celestial phenomena. Because, of course, in the ancient world, people believe that stars and planets are divine beings. And they specifically believe that stars are divine beings that are made from a different, more refined material that can exist in heaven, right? So Paul, when he describes the transformation of divine, like your body into the future resurrected body, he says, different things are made from different elements. Stars are made from one type of matter. Your body is made from a different type of matter. So he even uses stars as an example to tell the Corinthians what is it that he's talking about, right? And there is even an article by a scholar named Cliff Burnett, who thinks that when Paul mentions the specific passage in Romans where he mentions that it was promised that Abraham's seed is going to be like a star, like stars, we should actually interpret this as him affirming Catasterism, that he actually thinks that Christians, who are, of course, the progeny in this interpretation, are going to become divine beings in heaven. And the same guy, by the way, also wrote a book about Christ's enthronement at God's right-hand side, which is something that we've already mentioned, in the Greco-Roman cultural context. Because Christians usually point to a passage in Psalms, but the way how it's interpreted in the New Testament is basically in line with how royal courts work in like Eastern Mediterranean Empire in the Hellenistic period, and how there was a practice of appointing a co-ruler who sat on the right-hand side of the monarch, right? Mm-hmm. Which is the kind of imagery that the New Testament is painting.
I wondered about people becoming the stars, right? At the resurrection or something to this effect, if there was some connection. And I didn't know if you thought in the imagery in the book of Revelation that 2/3 of the stars would be swept by the tail of the dragon and such. If there's something to this mythology of these are gods that are being swept. I know that the chaos myth, what is it? She calls it it's Adela Yarborough Collins. She wrote about Book of Revelation, but I didn't know if you thought there was some connection to this mythology here.
I have never read that, so I don't know. Could be, but it's been a while since I read like a commentary on Revelation.
Yeah, it just reminded
me. You have this in in Daniel as well. Daniel 12:2, multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever.
And that sounds like a transformation from this realm, or from mortal lowliness, if we take Daniel as a 2nd century BC piece of literature that's Hellenized, and it has this kind of Platonic, or at least in some sense Stoic, Middle Platonist Greek philosophy plays with the realms. And here you have, like, they're going up, being translated up into the, as Paul describes it in 1 Corinthians 15, different flesh. The heavens have a different kind of flesh than we have. So there they are. They're becoming stars in a sense. I don't know.
What you also have here is a perfect sort of kind of syncretistic blending of Judaism with Hellenism.
Right.
Because what's kind of lacking in the Greco-Roman sources is this idea of an eschatology whereby you have a mass resurrection of the dead. So what we have here in Daniel, of course, it's equal parts Jewish, it's equal parts Hellenistic, and that this eschatological resurrection of the dead is taking a very Greco-Roman form.
Yeah. So that's all very fascinating. Of course, if you are a Christian and you are like offended by the idea that people can become divinized, well, you're probably not an Eastern Orthodox Christian. Or if you call yourself an Eastern Orthodox Christian, you are a LARPer, like American LARPer, right? But the people who actually live in like Russia, well, the official doctrine of the church is theosis, right? And of course, they are very careful to say that we are still monotheists, okay? So there is just one God, but we also believe in theosis. And that doesn't stop them from calling themselves, like, Jehovah's Witnesses call themselves monotheists, right? Mormons call themselves monotheists. Like, if it doesn't mean that you don't think that people can become divine beings, or that there are other divine beings.
I always wondered oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just want to say, like, the other thing that I think is very important, and one of the strongest reasons why I think there might be something to this connection, is that this whole concept of divine translation is something that is actually attested in the ancient world. And it's not like a modern invention that was then retrojected on the ancient sources. Like for example, the concept of the dying and rising gods, as far as I understand it, that's like a modern invention of anthropologists, like Fraser and these early 20th century guys, with specifically with Jesus in mind, right? But unlike the concept of the dying and rising God, this divine translation was actually a thing in the ancient world already. And people in the ancient world were able to recognize that all of these cases belong to the same category. And what's important is that when Christianity started, they recognized pretty much immediately that Jesus belongs to this category as well, right? So this is true about pagan critics of Christianity, like Celsus or Celsus, but also about early Christians themselves. You know, you have a number of people, Justin Martyr, Origen, Theophilus of Antioch, who actually place Jesus into the same category as these other figures, and say, well, if you Greeks believe this, then you should also believe in Jesus, right? Or at least it should prevent you because it's relevantly similar,
Right.
just like the virgin birth is relevantly similar to the conception of Perseus, when Zeus impregnates Danae in the form of a golden rain. Well, Justin Martyr says that's a virgin birth, right? And it's really interesting that this was such a common trope, and people were conscious that this is a trope, that, as I mentioned, when a body disappears, that's an indication that the person was translated into a divine realm. But also, it was such a trope that people were actually trying to fake it, right? And we have a number of examples of people who tried to die in such a way that their corpse disappears, so that there is this belief cemented that they were translated and now exist as divine beings. We have it for Alexander the Great, for example, who, when he was so ill that he knew he's going to die, he was thinking about jumping into the Euphrates River. And Arian, for example, says explicitly, so that people believe that he really was a son of Ammon, and he now ascended to heaven, right? Empedocles, the famous philosopher, there is a story how he jumped into the Etna volcano so that his body disappears again. Heraclides Ponticus tried to fake it unsuccessfully during his funeral and stuff like that. So yeah, that's also something that to keep in mind. This isn't something that we just invented. Now, people in the ancient world actually were aware that this is a thing, right?
This is a little bit off that specific topic, but John Dominic Crossan's recent book, Render Under Caesar, plays on this interesting trope here where we know about the Nero Redivivus myth, where Nero didn't really die, or he did die, but he's going to come back, depending on if you're looking at the Parthians, if you're looking at some of the Jewish writings, or even maybe the Romans themselves, because this is found in the Sibylline oracles, which get passed on through pagan. I'll just use the word pagan for the Greco-Roman world, to the Jewish, then the Christian sources, but they're all still carrying this for 5-6 centuries, thinking he's going to come back, and that he thinks that this is what they kind of made this parallel to Jesus. I mean, we had people actually try to impersonate Nero. At least 2, maybe more people really tried to impersonate Nero and have the Roman Empire get freaked out. I kind of wonder if some of these real people are actually just trying to imitate. This is the hard part about mimesis, and this gets us off topic, but the hard part about whether or not something happened historically or not is very difficult to parse, because you could look at something and go, there's no way, just to use an analogy, I do think this is literary and I don't buy this as historical, me personally, but my God, why have you forsaken me? Did Jesus really say that at his death, or is this similar to other gods who literally sing a song as they die? Or is it just to show you a connection to Psalms 22, showing mimesis? Or was there really possibly some people who are immersed in this kind of literature, and so they mimic it? I wonder if some of these other stories about people whose bodies go missing, if they're conspiring to actually have their bodies go missing when they die in order to somehow fit the model and be like, look, dude, this guy's body really went missing, or he never really died and they made it look like he died. I don't know. It makes me wonder.
Well, we have that in literature, right? Again, I mentioned Heraclides Ponticus, right? He tried to arrange it so that during his funeral, his body goes missing, and then there is a snake instead. And the implication is that this is a translation, again, connected with metamorphosis. So actually, he is actually translated into a snake, and that's other, like Peregrinus Proteus in Lucian, for example. Lucian says that he made up a story about how he saw an eagle fly from the pyre where Proteus was burned. And the eagle actually spoke in human voice saying, I'm done with the earth, to Olympus I fly, right? So again, this is a translation that's connected to transformation or metamorphosis into a divine animal. And interestingly enough, I was reading the other day, there is a 3rd century Greek historian named Herodian, and he writes about a funeral of, I think, Septimus Severus, but he actually describes like a general procedure of how a Roman emperor was buried if the Senate decreed that he is a god, that he was deified, right? And it's really interesting because the actual body of the emperor was buried, but then the Romans made a wax figure that was supposed to look exactly like the emperor. They put it on a couch and they treated it as if it was the emperor and it was still alive. So, for example, doctors came to him to like check on him and stuff like that. Then he was declared dead. Then there was the whole like state funeral, which was very opulent and complicated. And then the wax figure was placed on a funeral pyre and it was burned. And as it was burning, they released an eagle so that, and this is what Herodian says, so that this is like his soul being carried to heaven, right? And I'm just thinking, what's the point of the wax figurine, you know? Because I haven't done any reading into this, and it's true that like Romans had this tradition of having these like funeral masks that were made out of wax, but like why the whole body, you know? And I'm thinking, what happens with a body with a wax figurine when it burns in a pyre? It completely melts away. There are no remains, right? So again, you have a missing body.
Wow.
And it's even connected with, there are some accounts, first century accounts of the ascension of Heracles, where Iolaos, after, you know, Heracles dies by self-immolation, goes through the ashes and he doesn't find any remains. And again, there the implication is that, you know, his body goes missing, and the reason why you don't have any bones or anything like that is because he actually translated. So it could be the case that actually this kind of idea that it's appropriate for a person who is believed to ascend to heaven for his body to go missing and there being no remains was something that the Romans consciously imitated in their funeral practices of like deceased emperors. I don't know. Like, I would have to look up some literature whether this is something that's really going on. But it's like an interesting connection, you know. And of course, like the reason why the Romans did it wasn't to like trick people into thinking that this is the real emperor, this is his body, and now he's really ascending to heaven, right? It's specifically in Greek and Roman culture, religious rituals were often theatrical. So they had elements of drama, and they had elements of, for example, using props or just acting out something that isn't actually happening, right? Like a lot of rituals replaced a human sacrifice with some kind of substitutionary sacrifice. So, for example, in mythology, the ritual actually involves someone dying, but when the ritual was performed, they did something different instead. So, and I think in the Roman funeral, the idea is that this isn't like a show. They are not trying to trick people. They are just ritualistic playing out this process of divination because they believe that the emperor was actually divinized. And that's why, you know, like everyone knew that there is a guy who like released the eagle and that it wasn't anything supernatural actually going on. It's just how the religion worked, right?
I think there's something like that with Julius Caesar with the wax figurine. And they reenact, if you will. There's still to this day reenactments of what happened when he died at the hands of the Senate and stuff. So there's something to this. It's a Roman tradition. I'll have to look that up further. But I do wonder if there's a carryover in this tradition. My sister-in-law, she lost an infant of hers, or really, really young child to SIDS. And we went to the funeral, and I noticed that they released these doves at the funeral. And the way I understood this when I was there and I witnessed it, these are like domesticated doves, right? Like these are like well-groomed, beautiful white doves that they released 3 of. 3, I imagine, because of the Holy Spirit. 2 of them, I think, go away. 1 comes back. I can't remember how it went, but like they're like trained to do something. And they release these doves, and you kind of wonder if the way we kind of thought of it is like, there's her spirit, the way people were at the funeral going, there's her spirit being taken by the dove that descended upon Jesus, of course, is now taking her to heaven, taking her spirit with her to heaven or something like that. So you wonder if there is this still, like you're showing in the Greek world, we still practice at some of our funerals today within the Christian context, this carryover, if you will.
You know, in filmmaking, you know what's one of the best ways to signalize to your audience that a character is like a divine being, like Angel, for example, that the human characters are talking to them, they turn around and the person disappears. Like we still do it today, like to this day. When that happens in a movie, you know there's something going on, right? Like Batman does it with Commissioner Gordon. He's not a divine being, or he's not supposed to be. He's just like a superhero, right?
Right.
But in movies that have like supernatural stuff going on, this happens all the time. So that might be something as well. And of course, one specific subtype of this divine translation, which people actually think, like scholars actually think there is a genetic connection, is sanctification in not just Roman Catholicism but also in other branches of Christianity, right? Because in the metaphysics of the process, you think that saints in heaven occupy like a higher position in the heavenly hierarchy than ordinary people, deceased people. For example, they have the power of I'm just blinking on the English word, where basically you intercession. They have intercessionary powers, right? So when I go to a Roman Catholic church here, people are going to be praying to a saint so that he intercedes on behalf of people who are on earth, right? And there are other specific characteristics of Christian saints that are similar to these translated or deified beings in the ancient world. For example, they're patrons of various occupations, areas of life, activities and stuff like that. And they, like every saint has its own bucket of he has like a part of the word cornered that he takes care of. Like there is a patron of mining, I think it's Santa Barbara. There is a patron of firefighters, prostitutes, even thieves and stuff like that, repentant thieves.
I remember, by the way, I remember doing landscaping for a Roman Catholic friend of my dad's. And he asked me in the process, he had a Ziploc bag with these statuesque little things that were saints. And he said, bury it upside down in the front of my garden. This will protect my home.
Yeah,
these are Roman Catholic. Okay, so
yeah, I know.
I'm with you.
I'm going to tell you something really hilarious. But let me just finish this. So, countries, for example, have saints, right? There is a saint for a specific, like saint. Who is the patron saint of Ireland?
What?
Who is the patron saint of Ireland?
Let me look it up.
Never mind, right? And in the ancient world, countries and city-states have
Saint
their
Patrick.
patron deity. Yeah, Saint Patrick, of course. So in the ancient world, every country and every city-state had its own patron deities, right? They were like unique to that location very often. And you know, like Roman Catholics do all kinds of weird stuff that, to be honest, sounds pagan to me. For example, like one of the most hilarious things that I've ever heard is I actually went to a very famous Roman Catholic monastery in Bohemia that's connected to the kind of the foundational mythology of the country in Dark Middle Ages, like how it came to be that it was a kingdom established and stuff like that. And I shit you not, in it, they have something that's called Palladium of Bohemia. It's like a Christian relic, a Christian artifact. There is a story about it, about how like Saint Wenceslav was wearing it when he was martyred, and just before that, he like threw it away into a field so it wasn't discovered. Then in High Middle Ages, some like peasant discovered it, and now it's Palladium. You know and it's supposed to be like a supernatural protection of the kingdom. So as long as the Palladium is like in Bohemia, I don't know, there is a force field or something that like protects the country. And you know what's Palladion in the ancient world? It was a statue of Athena in the city of Troy. And the myth was that as long as the statue is in the city cannot be conquered. So Odysseus, and I think Diomedes, if I remember correctly, they had to sneak into Troy, snatch the statue, steal the statue, take it out, so that then Troy can be captured, because the statue isn't projecting its like supernatural protection over the city, which is what statues, like cultic statues of gods, did in many other locations as well. How are you not seeing this when you are a Roman Catholic, or do you not care? Like, this is idolatry. I'm sorry, like how is it the case that like a Roman Catholic country, or a country that has like 30, where Roman Catholicism is the strongest denomination, has basically a pagan amulet like that's granting supernatural protection, that's even called the same thing, and nobody cares.
I do want to go back and reread biblically if the Ark of the Covenant, which would have potentially, depending on the scholar, housed the deity Yahweh himself. I wonder if the Ark of the Covenant had to be removed from the temple when they went to destroy it during the Babylonian going to fight against them in Babylon, which makes me kind of wonder, did they have to remove the deity from the temple in order to destroy it? I need to reread it, because there's always these little scenarios where the Ark of the Covenant is removed and then brought back. And when it's removed, there's like the Israelites are concerned about their complete well-being and stuff. And then later in late Second Temple Judaism, the Ark of the Covenant isn't playing a role. So you kind of wonder what's going on there. I do have a super chat real quick. William Arens, thank you for the super chat, my friend. I appreciate it. This is just more points towards your apotheosis, my friend. Doesn't the eschatological hopes of some Christians rely on their belief that they will be resurrected and rule along with Christ as divine king?
Yes.
Well, you would have to ask some Christians, because there are all kinds of. If you think about it, Christianity is kind of weird because it has two different systems of the afterlife kind of stuck on top of each other, right? Because you have the old Jewish, not old, like 2nd century Jewish idea of like everything goes as normal. When you die, you go to sleep, so you have no conscious experience, and then you wake up. It's parousia. Jesus has come. There are horse demon locusts that kill like a third of the people or whatever, and then people are resurrected, and there is the kingdom of God, right? And then history proceeds from there. But then you have a different system of managing the afterlife, where immediately after you die, you are judged and you go either to hell or to heaven. And so these are like two different things combined, essentially. And I always wonder how it is supposed to work, like in minds of individual Christians. Because when you ask a Christian, they are going to essentially describe one or the other. So some Christians actually think that, oh, my grandma who died last year, now she doesn't have any experiences. She's just in Sheol or somewhere waiting to be resurrected at some point. But more often than not, they think that, no, she is now in heaven already, which kind of makes the whole final judgment after the resurrection redundant, right? Because everyone who has died has been judged already.
It's a very complex thing, because obviously they're still waiting for the final things to all happen before you would imagine the reigning with Christ would happen. I mean, aren't the saints that have been martyrs in Revelation, aren't they crying, how long, O Lord, underneath the seat waiting for these things to happen? Because Jerusalem's supposed to come down to earth in this story at the end, and no more tears, no more suffering, all this stuff. But Derek, you shouted a resounding yes, and I reminded of Bart Ehrman when I was thinking of the historical Jesus, trying to wrap my head around. I asked him, do you think that the idea of Jesus telling the disciples that they will rule on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel in the eschaton, at the end? And Bart says he just doesn't see why that would be completely made up. It's one of the reasons he said is that Judas is alive and well here, and Jesus is saying, you 12 will be seated on 12 thrones. Whoopsie. One of them doesn't get to sit in one of those damn seats, it seems, because he betrayed him. So he wonders if this is an early echo of the Christ movement, where Jesus is, among his little following saying, look, I'm going to be going to be reigning. And in fact, he even goes further. Bart believes there's a historical kernel for the death of Jesus as being king of the Jews, or like being heralded as king of the Jews, that he was in some sense to his small group being seen as that messianic Messiah figure who was going to be probably the king in this kingdom that God was going to establish on earth. So if we take an apocalyptic approach, then maybe there's some validity to, the disciples at least were reigning on thrones. I can't imagine that Christians didn't start putting themselves in the place of disciples in some way, shape, or form, especially martyrs. So yeah, there's this idea that I think continues. What do you guys think?
I think that's precisely what is said here. Again, to quote Ephesians, and God raised us up with Christ and seated us with him in the heavenly realms in Christ Jesus. The imagery is of being taken up and enthroned along with him to rule as divine king. So I think William's question can absolutely be answered in the affirmative.
Yeah, and it could be the case that like the idea that there are these 12 specific people who are going to be the co-rulers, that doesn't have to be, that could be like a stand-in for the Christian community, right? Because the apostles are the people who are described in the text. At the time, there happens to be 12 of them. But when you are reading this in 2nd or 3rd or 4th century, what you are supposed to be reading into it is that, now you are, and your community are essentially the apostles, right? Because you are carrying the tradition.
That could be the case too. I've heard some people just say the 12 is almost not literal. Like if you're with Christ, if you're in Christ, like you could somehow see it in a different way. Bart takes it to be a kernel, kind of like when Matthew talks about you will not have gone through all the houses in Israel before the Son of Man comes. You kind of go, what the heck kind of nugget is that? That failed on its face. I mean, like, unless you want to say, well, what he means by Son of Man here in the 2nd or 3rd century is what he means is it's something else, But there's other academics who do think this is an embarrassment. I do think that this is an embarrassment personally, though I can imagine we can find ways to like make sense of the data and not make it embarrassing, or at least say maybe it has a later significance. Because I really scratch my head with the Gospel of Matthew. Not so much Luke, not so much Mark. I mean, Mark's amazing, but Matthew's weird to me, and I just don't want to get stuck on Matthew right now. But it's like I can't help but wonder. There's some material that just sounds even more primitive than Mark, as Jewish as it is. But then it's like has this late feel to it, like replacement theology at the same time. It's the weirdest little book to me. Anywho. Thank you, William, for that super chat. I really appreciate it. Let me ask you guys a more direct question for those who stuck around an hour and 22 minutes. Can we list off some names of deities? We titled this Jesus Among Other Gods. And when I say gods, you can use humans that become divine. You can use gods that were pre-existent that come down, become mortals, and then go into heaven. Or even gods that are completely gods at all times, but there's some similarities to the stories of Jesus. Can you guys name other gods and compare them to Jesus?
I actually have, you can categorize it, right? Because so there are dozens of examples. I think we could easily go over 100. And we have a lot of sources, even sources that are roughly contemporary with the New Testament. Historical poets talk about this stuff a lot as well, right? And there's so many cases that you can actually categorize them. Right. So just going through the ones that I can know, or I can just like recall quickly, I put together some categories, right?
You want me to share your screen or something? Or you didn't?
We can go into some passages because I have some passages prepared, but let me just really quickly enumerate it. So you have sons and daughters of gods who ascend because they are already divided in some sense. Then you have, and this is probably the most common, you have people who excel in some kind of virtue. So they either earn it, or the virtue is like a signal, it signalizes that they are already divided in some way, and that's why they are so excellent. So it could be wisdom, it could be physical strength, like Heracles, it could be beauty. Athletes are very often being divinized. Medical skill. Hippocrates is one of these deified beings, right? Divine beings. You have kings and other rulers that covers Roman emperors, but also various kings, for example, Egyptian kings in the Hellenistic period who were believed to be deified. Then you have victims of injustice or violence, where the deification is either a reward for going through some kind of suffering, or it happens in order to prevent suffering. So some people get in danger and they are about to be killed, or something bad is about to happen to them, and basically the gods take pity on them, so they translate them instead, right? Then you have people who disappear in rivers, particularly young girls. There is more than one example. Then you have people who disappear in battles. That's also very common. And then this is something that I've already mentioned, people who become immortalized because they consume some kind of special food that turns them immortal. And these categories are usually mixed, right? So, for example, Aeneas, the mythical founder of the Roman ancestors, he is a son of God. He became a king, and then he disappeared in battle, and he was translated, right? So he never died. It's just he did it. Historical people sometimes disappear in battle as well. For example, Hieron I, one of the rulers of Carthage, he disappeared in the 5th century in the Battle of Jimena. And one of the theories was that, he is a divine being, right? Because people couldn't find his body. He was nowhere. There is one account talks about how one of the generals of the opposing army kind of looked at him, then he looked away, and he was gone, right? So that's a divine translation right there. Or you have, for example, these stories of young girls who disappear in rivers, and that's because they are exceptionally beautiful. That's one of the virtues that you can have. Like, one of the reasons why you could be deified is because you are just so beautiful that a god decides to translate you, and you become his wife, right? That's a legitimate reason as well. So yeah, we can absolutely go into some of these examples. If I can share my screen, I have some prepared. So let me do it.
I also will, when we get through some of these, I'd like to get into dying and rising. Why this is a category.
This is important because we need to, if there are Christians listening to us, they are probably screaming right now because inspiring philosophy has already debunked all of that, right? This is just dying and rising gods, and that has been addressed to death. This is not what we are talking about, right? And it's important for people to get the difference.
Yeah, I want us to spell that out and to give it a better shot so people understand it.
So let me know how much I need to actually make this larger.
A little bit bigger if you can, just to see if... Yeah. All right, I think that might work right there, I think.
Okay, yeah, it might just about work. So some of these are so strange that they are almost no longer recognizable as translation myths, right? So we have Suetonius, he's a Roman historian, biographer, and he mentions a guy called Gaius Epidius of Nuceria, and it says that he threw himself into the source of the river Sarnus, so into like a spring, right, stream, and he came out shortly afterwards with golden horns on his head. Then he at once disappeared and was reckoned among the number of the gods. Now, when you read it, you wouldn't connect it with Jesus, right? But I would argue, and there are scholars who agree, that this actually belongs to the same category, because you have a disappearance. In this case, you have someone who disappears into a river, which is a trope already, and then he comes out, and this is like his post-translation experience, his post-translation appearance, and he has tauromorphic features. So he has golden horns. This is to signify that he is now a deity, because a lot of deities have tauromorphic features, right? There are horned gods. Humans don't have horns, they don't have golden horns, but gods can have golden horns, right? So him appearing to people with golden horns is equivalent to Jesus's resurrected body having supernatural properties in the Gospels. It's a way to signalize that he's a god. And then, just like Jesus, he disappears and he's reckoned among the number of the gods. And it's actually interesting because if you look at the specific verb in Latin, that's a verb for return, because Romans believed in pre-existence. So when Roman sources talk about, for example, Caesar Augustus and how he was translated, they use verbs like redeo, return back, because they thought that he already existed before his birth, right? So this isn't just like people becoming gods. No, these are divine beings who already existed. Then they were born to mortal mothers on earth, and then they returned to the heavenly realm afterwards. Yeah. I have Aeneas. So, battle. The body of Aeneas was nowhere to be seen, and it had been translated to the gods. This is Semiramis, Queen Semiramis. So this is a really interesting example, because that's not a Greek and not a Roman example, but this is how it looks like for a Hellenized version of a story that's coming from a different nation. So in this case, this is a Babylonian context. So this would be equivalent to Josephus writing about Enoch or Elijah, right? So she remembered a prophecy. Because she received a prophecy, she knew that this is going to happen to her, and she disappeared again, as if she were going to be translated to the gods, as the oracle predicted. And then there is the specific Babylonian twist to it. So this is where the context, the local cultural context, came into play, because some say that she turned into a dove and flew off in the company of many birds. And this is the reason why the Assyrians worship the god as a god, right? So this is someone taking a existing Babylonian myth and rehashing it in these Hellenistic terms. So the vocabulary and the concept is the same, but there is an older, non-Greek, non-Roman tradition, and these two fuse together in this account. And I think what you have with Jesus is similar, because you have these already existing Jewish ideas of catasterization, resurrection, and stuff like that. But you then talk about it using this concept of divine translation. And you say, oh, Jesus, he disappeared. He ascended to heaven, you know. And we are going to do that. We are going to meet him in the air, because we are going to be transformed. We are not going to have physical bodies. We are going to have spiritual bodies. And then we will rule and judge the angels in heaven. And that's going to be great. Any questions or comments?
No.
Cool. So let's go on. Kalirohoe. This sounds really Jesus-y, really like New Testament-y, right? Because she dies. So this is a novel, Kalirohoe, Chariton and Kalirohoe, where basically it looks like the main character, it looks like she's dead, right? So people think she's dead, even though she isn't. So they place her in a tomb. Of course, she wakes up, but just as she wakes up, some pirates land. They want to rob the tomb. They find a girl inside, so they take her captive, and she's abducted. Now, of course, the other main character, her lover, goes to the tomb, and he discovers that the tomb is empty. So not even the corpse is lying there. So we have an empty tomb, right? In this case, the person wasn't actually dead, but the main character doesn't know that. And what is it that happens, right? So many different speculations were entertained by the crowd. But Chaereas, the main character, says, which of the gods have become my rival and carried off Kalirohoe and now keeps her with him? So the one thing, like the first thing that this main character of this fictional novel, probably first or second century novel, thinks when he discovers an empty corpse, right? Well, he thinks that his wife, Kalirhoe, was so beautiful that she was translated into heaven, and now she was married. She's married into a god, which means that she is a goddess herself, right? And she even gives us some examples. Just like Dionysus stole Ariadne from Theseus and Zeus Semele from Actaeon, right? So these are other famous examples where mortal women were translated and became deified and became consorts of gods.
I like what you're saying here. The way that this is written, if we didn't know what they thought or how they thought about the gods and how translating took place and why, like, to me, this tells you if she's beautiful and she dies, we know why. It's almost like today, I'll give you an analogy. When a person dies, oftentimes today people will say they were too good for this world. They were too good for this world. That's why they were taken. That's why they were taken from this world. Only the good die young, right? So there's this like modern analogy where we kind of in society say the reason someone dies or they're gone, they're taken, they're no longer with us. They had to go to heaven, as Christians like to understand it, is because they were so good or just too good for this world. This is just one example to kind of
I'm not sure if there is a connection, but it's important to realize that, like, in the ancient world, physical beauty was actually like a perfectly legitimate virtue, right? Mm-hmm. Or like a characteristic. Now, after 2,000 years of Christian tradition, that is very like that is a component of detachment from the physical and from like physical beauty and stuff like that. We perceive it differently. But if there was a beautiful girl in the ancient world, people could actually mistake her for a goddess. Like, even in this narrative, even in this novel, she comes somewhere to like a new city, and people think, well, is she a goddess? Because she's just such beauty. So she is so beautiful, and it's so common in the minds of people in the 1st or 2nd century for gods to appear in human form and actually interact with people. That it becomes plausible that this could actually be a divine being, right? It's not meant as a flattery. It's a belief that people actually operate with on like a daily basis. It's like when you walk down the street in some like big city and you're thinking, oh, is it Nicolas Cage? It could be, right? Like, if you are in Paris, there is a chance that you meet someone famous, especially if it's like a touristy area or something like that. And I imagine it could have been similar in the ancient world. But what I wanted to highlight is what's there next. Or can it be that I had a goddess as my wife and didn't even know about it? So here you have pre-existence. Because this couple, before they became married, they knew each other their entire lives, right? They were from the same city, from Syracuse, and they then, they fell in love very young. That's usually how it goes in these novels, and they get married. So him wondering whether it could be the case that she was a goddess all along, means that she would have to be a god or goddess that was born into a human body, grew up, became an adult, and then ascended to heaven, right?
I gotta just say this, and I know we gotta keep going, but I think all three of us would agree. Like, think about what's being said right there, and then apply that notion, not the beauty part, but apply the notion to Jesus for a moment, okay? And imagine if this noble man is your teacher, and in some way they're equating and saying, this guy, he had to have been divine, like he always was, but notice something. This is a statement in retrospect. After she's already gone, then it dawns, and it's like, actually, I might have been married to a god all along. In fact, Jesus might have actually been a god all along. What were we thinking?
And what's the trigger in the story? Like, what is the event that makes him think this? It's a missing body.
Yeah,
in a tomb, right?
So oh, this is good.
They discovered that the stones had been moved and that the entrance is wide open. Like, right. I'm not saying that the author of this novel knew the Gospels. It's possible. Yeah. And I'm not saying that the Gospels knew this story, because the dating it says 2nd century here, but the dating range is really wide. I think I've seen 1st century BCE as well. But, so I'm not saying that, right? I'm not saying that there is like copying or mimesis. I'm just saying that this was a culture that where these kinds of stories and these kinds of ideas were really, really common. And just think about how little surviving texts we actually have in the ancient world. Like almost everything that was written by the Greeks, Romans, Jews, and so on is lost, right? Just we know of about 800 Latin-speaking authors in the ancient world, and we have extensive writings from only about 200 of them. There must have been tens of thousands of people who wrote literary works in the ancient world, right? So, given this massive loss of evidence, the fact that in the relatively small corpus of literature that we still have available, given that we have so many these examples that we can point to that are so similar, that's not a coincidence, right?
Wow.
This was just like what people did back then. These were the kinds of stories that they narrated, right? It's just like, why would you think that Jesus, of all of these people, is the one that actually rose from the dead and ascended from heaven?
Great point, Camille. Derek, what do you think of that, man? I love that. What do you think?
Yeah, and one of the things I was really wanting to kind of pick Camille's brain about is kind of shifting here a little bit, but when we think about,
we'll come back.
Yeah, when we think about how the resurrection of Jesus, how that belief originally came about, what instigated that, what inspired that, versus, how it came to be later understood and portrayed as Christianity continued to develop and progress. But, what was it that inspired early Christians to initially believe that Jesus had been raised from the dead? I think we're often in the habit of asking, was this a belief that was originally Jewish, or was it originally pagan or Greco-Roman? And that, of course, might be a prime example of the bifurcation fallacy, wherein we're used to thinking in either or terms, when often it's a both and. But a fascinating online book, so anyone can read this online. It's called Resurrection, A Symbol of Hope, by Lloyd Gearing, a professor of New Testament and early Christianity, I believe out of Australia. And in one of the chapters, Resurrection, a Symbol of Exaltation, that's what he digs into, is what initially inspired belief in Jesus' resurrection. If we think, as I do, that there probably was an historical Jesus who had a following who many looked to as a Messiah figure, and that he winds up meeting with a cruel death on the cross, and this gives way to a sort of cognitive dissonance reduction type scheme wherein they are searching the scriptures to try and make sense of this tragedy. And naturally you find in the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, they're able to reason that, the crucifixion was, his suffering and death was an atonement, a vicarious suffering for mankind. You could easily apply that template to what actually historically happened to Jesus. And then, of course, if that's where you're going, and we know the early Christians did this. I mean, it's enshrined in the early creed in 1 Corinthians 15 that Christ died, that he was buried according to the scriptures, that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. We know that they were looking there. We have examples of this throughout the New Testament. Therein, that portion of Isaiah 53, what's the very first verse there in 52:13, which is all part of that whole suffering servant scriptural motif there, that he would be raised and lifted up and highly exalted bingo. If they're looking to Isaiah 53 to reconcile this with an atonement tragedy, right there you find, where they would easily see his resurrection and exaltation here. So the question I think I'm wondering is, would that alone, would that have been enough to inspire the earliest belief among Christians that Christ had been raised and exalted? Or is this also partially inspired by what's already prominent in the Greco-Roman world? Or did they possibly see, was this possibly already something of a Greco-Roman apotheosis type scenario in which that was first, and then they tried to reinforce that with scriptural antecedents? I just really want to pick Camille's brain here and see what he thinks.
And then when you answer that, Camille, we got some super chats we're gonna grab if that's cool.
Okay, so like if I actually knew the answer and if I could prove it, I wouldn't be talking to you guys. No offense, but no, I've gone through kind of a process. It's like, when there is this meme that shows a human mind, and it then it gradually lights up, right? So it's more and more like it shines more and more. There's like a procession, and you're supposed to put ideas or concept or something like that in these different stages. So I'm not going to say that thinking that Jesus was actually raised is like the first stage where you have the X-ray scan of Homer Simpson when there is just like this tiny brain in an empty skull. That would be incredibly offensive, so I don't want to go there. But I like, some people think, okay, maybe Jesus's body actually went missing, and that's how the belief started. Right. So I think that's just like the brain that is only like lighting a little bit, Then you have the brain that's pretty much lit up already, and that's this. I think this is probably the most common view among people who are not Christians. Apologia would, for example, be like a good example of a person who thinks something like that. You have this idea that there was a cognitive dissonance, right? That the people who actually knew Jesus, whoever that might have been, because it could have been Celsus, but it could have been Cephas, but it could have been someone 10 years before, right? They didn't expect him to die. And after he died, they were thinking, well, what does it mean? What does it mean? They went to the Hebrew Bible. They discovered the suffering servant in Isaiah. And that's how the story developed. Basically what you've just described, right? I think it's fine. But now I'm actually so far gone, and like my soul is so damned to hell, that now I'm even thinking that this doesn't necessarily have to be the explanation, because what this explanation does, it basically presupposes the narrative that we have in the Gospels. Because where does this idea that Jesus' disciples didn't expect his death and were experiencing cognitive dissonance after his death, where does it come from? Well, it comes from the Gospels, right? Because in the Gospels, before he dies, they don't know anything, and they don't understand anything. And after he dies, they still don't understand anything. Like even in the Emmaus, on the road to Emmaus, when Jesus actually reveals himself to them, the first question that they ask him is, okay, well, are you going to restore the kingdom of Israel? Even though they understand that now he's alive again, they are thinking, well, is this it? Like, are we going to kick the Romans' ass, right? And he has to explain that, no, actually, that's not what this is about. So, and I'm thinking, okay, if this is your explanation, that you are still like taking things that are in the Gospels for granted, and you're treating them as like historical facts in this model, in this argumentation. But why would you? Like, why would you think that the people who actually knew Jesus didn't expect his death? And why would you think that they experienced cognitive dissonance? Like, it's a good explanation. It works as an explanation, but really comes from the Gospels, right? And I'm so far gone now that I actually think it could be entirely possible that after Jesus died, it was very natural and very appropriate for the people who knew him to immediately conclude that he was just the kind of person who would go through deification or through divine translation, right? You don't have to have any cognitive dissonance. You don't have to have these crushed messianic hopes or anything like that. It's just this was a thing that was already common. People thought about these terms, thought about it in these terms. So it could be the case that Jesus was just the kind of person that it made sense after he died to imagine that he went through this process. And everything that you've just described, Isaiah, suffering servant, stuff like that, that came later, like decades later, So this is what I think could be the case.
I want to throw a case at you, but I do want to get these super chats too, just to get your thoughts. I recently interviewed Richard Carrier. He came out here. We recorded a few courses, right? And I said, "Look, man, I know you think there probably wasn't a guy, but we're going to do a recording. And in this recording, I want this to be you're a historicist. This is how I wanted to do this recording." And he thought that the best position, historically speaking, is you have Josephus accounting for all these guys who practically are like, I mean, you could almost say, in a way, suicidal. I mean, they're running up against Rome. They die. Every single one of them is like, damn, Bobby just got his head cut off the other day. I'll just keep doing what I'm doing. I'm going to keep, poking at the biggest monster on planet Earth, Rome, and see what happens. So they all know they're on like a kamikaze mission. And he thought that, like, in some way with the data, that there's so much within the Gospels and Paul of like Jesus needing to be a sacrifice. There's pre-existent literature where, and in Daniel, where the servant or the Messiah figure was going to his death, that here is this really extremist guy, nutty enough to literally go to his death, which we see people willing to die for things all the time. So he goes and literally gets himself killed. So rather than needing to explain it through cognitive dissonance reasoning, there might be some cognitive dissonance explanations for some things, I'm sure. But it's like this guy actually went to die, expecting to die. He even like lets his disciples know, like, hey, dude, I'm going to die. And he thought that if we were taking a historical model, at least it could account for much of the data we do see in the Gospels, as that's the trajectory. What do you think about that model, rather than it's all post hoc?
That's possible as well. Like I'm fairly minimalist. I do think it is the case that Jesus just happens to be Jesus of Nazareth, the actual guy, just happens to be one of the people that essentially disappeared from history, right? And that, like, if I had to write down all the specific propositions that I think are probably true about Jesus, that I would like bet a substantial amount of money on, it would be a very, very short list. And a lot of people find it incredible because of how much writing we have about him so early on after his life. It is true that for a lot of ancient figures, we don't have that many documents written about them so early on. In some cases we do, but it's pretty much, it's a big outlier, right? But I think it's just because Christianity became popular, right? Like, just think about it. Like, if Christianity didn't become popular, what would we know about Jesus? The letters of Paul wouldn't survive. Nobody would copy them. The Gospels either wouldn't be written or they wouldn't survive, just like we have just small fragments from these apocryphal Gospels, especially the early ones, right? Maybe archaeologists would find a fragment of a paper in Egypt with like few verses from one of the Gospels, but they wouldn't have any context, so they wouldn't know like what they are reading. They would think, oh, this is a really interesting like aretology or something like that. And we would maybe have him mentioned in Tacitus, and we would maybe have him mentioned in Josephus, depending on what you think about it. Like, and that's it, right?
Right.
It's a guy who disappeared from history. Like, there was this person that I mentioned before who was divinized, and he appeared with the horns, right? That one paragraph, it's like 3 sentences. That's the only passage that he appears in the entire surviving ancient literature. That's the one place, and it just happens to be. It just happens that it survived. It's not even in like a story that. It's not even in like a literature where this particular relevant. It's in Suetonius, in biographies of rhetoricians, and the story is only mentioned because he was supposed to be an ancestor of a famous rhetorician. So it's like an off-the-cuff story. It's exactly what you have in Testimonium Flavianum, right? Doesn't even fit into what the context is in the actual work. So this is what we would have for Jesus if Christianity didn't survive. But it's just the one religion that became popular. So of course we have this massive amounts of information about Jesus. But I think that the actual person is lost in history. And there was someone actually on MythVision recently. I don't know who that was. Maybe it was Faith Robin Walsh, who said that
I was thinking
actually it like the fact that the historical Jesus disappeared, reliable information, easily accessible information about him disappeared so early on after his death. That might have actually been an advantage for the movement, because she said, well, if you are a Platonist or if you're arguing about Plato, you could always go back into and read his works and kind of figure out what he meant. There is always the question of interpretation and stuff like that, but it puts boundaries on the interpretation of Plato, his like personality, his opinions and stuff like that you could get. For Jesus, you don't have anything like that, right? Because early Christians, even late 1st and 2nd century, they didn't have anything.
That's why there's so many gospels and so many epistles and so many different teachings and things. Yeah, that made it, like you said, there's an advantage to the survival. If we take an evolutionary approach, you can literally adapt to any environment, culture, whatever with Christianity, and it'll succeed. This is why we have weird Manichaeism in the East and West and so many variations of Christianity. I always say that's why Christianity is so successful, because it literally has the Bruce Lee philosophy become.
It's a Rorschach test, right? You can people still do it today. That's one of the cliches is that every New Testament scholar comes up with a reconstruction of historical Jesus that they like, including Richard Carrier, apparently.
Yeah. Well, I mean, everybody does it, and which one makes the most sense to you? Let me get these super chats here. Doug, do you think there's any possible relationships between tefillah purification and water translation to divinity?
I don't know what that is. I'm sorry.
I'm gonna just assume something here. Let me look down and see if Doug answered this. Just to be on the safe side. Doug, forgive me if I butcher this, but let's just say this. So water translation to divinity, baptism, water purification, any of these rites, do you think they play in a role in some sense?
I mean, there is an interpretation of baptism, because baptism is usually interpreted in line of purification rituals in Judaism and stuff like that, right? So basically, and purification was really common in other cultures, in Greek religious rituals. So basically, the idea is that instead of you being purified ritualistically repeatedly, for example, before every sacred meal or offering or something like that, you just do it once. It's an initiation ritual and you're good. So that's the standard interpretation. But then I've read a different interpretation that it has to do with the Holy Spirit. So basically, when you go through baptism, that's when the Holy Spirit kind of indwells you. Mm-hmm. That's when you get it, kind of. That's when it's just like when people expose their kids to these harmless diseases so that they get through them like early on, right? They don't have to get them when they are adults. That would be kind of a similar idea, that you get through baptism, through this initiation ritual, because that's when you get the Holy Spirit and you have the benefits and stuff like that.
So that might play some, but it's still not the same category as what you're suggesting in a way.
There is a really good book about this. It's called, I have it somewhere. I think Signs and Wonders, something like that. It explains a lot of. It basically interprets Paul in the Mediterranean context. I don't think I have it. Yeah, it's by a female scholar. Her name is Her last name is Eyl, E-Y-L. It's relatively recent, from 2019. It's called Signs, Wonders, and Gifts. And the subtitle is something like Paul in the Greco-Roman World or something like that.
Okay, so I was in the right path here, just making sure it's a Jewish ritual purification in mikvah, a sacred water source, possibly the predecessor to baptism. Thank you so much. I'm glad I somewhat got that correct. Margaret de Velden, thank you, Margaret, for the super chat. Good to see you here this morning. Why do people go to tombs after a death? Isn't the body already prepared?
Well, in the case of Kaliroa, it's to mourn, right? And actually, in the ancient world specifically, there was a cult of the dead. So living people worshipped their ancestors. When this is something that we still do today. Like, I think the tradition of visiting graves and tombs of your family, that's like a secular remnant of an ancient tradition of the cult of the dead, where you treat dead people as a part of your community and you visit their graves and you perform religious rituals there. Libation, for example. So one, like a typical ritual that was performed in the Greek context on a tomb or a grave was libation. There were even specific vessels that had like specific shape, specific way how they were decorated, even specific terminology that were placed on tombs so that the relatives that come to the tomb can perform this libation. And like libation is basically a food offering, or in this case, drink offering. So you pour the drink on the ground and you are offering that to the deceased person who is in Hades, which in this case is down, right? It's not up, it's down. That's why you put it on the ground. So this is what people did, right? So people actually visited tombs quite often, either to mourn the dead, which was, of course, connected to this religious practice, but also to continue worshiping them after they die.
Thank you for
the
that.
Worship day after they die.
There's a book, an interesting book called Coming Back to Life, that goes into the ancient Greek practices in this. Various scholars are in this. And there's another scholar I emailed recently who wrote a book about ancient worship of your ancestors in ancient Israel. And so this is a fun topic to me. I've even asked if Yahweh might have been a man at once who became deified, who was a warrior or something. Like, this is I know that these are questions people have, but I have asked this of Daniel McClellan, and he did his dissertation on this, and his people are like, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm just saying, the region in the south in Canaan, it wouldn't have been ridiculous to have these notions of people who become deified, like pharaohs would be deified and such. So you kind of wonder, it's not off the table, is all I'm saying. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for the super chat. Derek, you need to do a video on near-death experiences of heaven and hell. I'm sure people are terrified of these stories.
We can do an episode on Greek near-death experiences, about people who die and they have visions of the afterlife that involve Greek deities, like the myth of Er in Plato. That's fun, right? Because it just shows you how what you see usually is what you're conditioned to believe.
Right.
Derek, I don't want to monopolize the time, so feel free to be more assertive.
Yeah, no, I'm just trying to get through these super chats, and then
the other Derek.
Oh, Derek.
Yeah.
Derek?
Have anything to add to this question necessarily, but I was thinking about the whole the women visiting the tomb and the Gospels there. I think there's multiple layers there. I think that for one thing, these are, I agree completely with Robin Faith Walsh, for instance, that these are elite cultural producers in the Greco-Roman world, and that it was just so common for women to be associated with these kinds of burial procedures that it made sense for someone like Mark to have women on the scene there. You find this too, like in the first century play by Seneca, Hercules Otaeus, where Hercules had indeed died. He's been taken up now, and he appears to Alcmena, to his mother, who's mourning him. And he says, kind of conveys the same message there that Jesus does to Mary Magdalene in the Gospel of John, that refrain from mourning. And you know what I mean? That I have been granted my place in heaven among the gods. You know, why do you cry, woman? I'm in a better place, in a better condition now. So you know, contra the Christian apologists who think that this is some kind of this just falls right into the criterion of embarrassment and therefore must be historically accurate. I think that's just absolutely ridiculous. I think it falls right in line with the kinds of traditions that we know about. And it's not even true that women everywhere and at all times were completely distrusted. When we look at, I think the torpedo in the hull of this argument is John 4:39, where it says that a whole slew of Samaritan women are convinced by the testimony of who? A woman.
You mean men, Samaritan men.
I'm sorry?
You said Samaritan women, but you meant Samaritan men were convinced by the testimony of a Samaritan woman.
Of the Samaritan woman, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I just think that this is precisely what we would expect from first century ancient fiction in the Greco-Roman world. I think it fits.
Yeah, Seneca is specifically a contemporary of Jesus. I'm not sure if Jesus, he died under Nero, so roughly, right? So you're telling me that there's like a first century account of a translated deity who appears to his mother and announces what happened to him. That's amazing. And also we have Liberalis, who is a second century author who describes how Zeus sent Hermes to steal Alcmena's body after she dies and take her to the afterlife. And she was given to wife to Radamantes, who is another translated hero. So Hermes stole the body and he put a stone in the coffin. And the sons of Heracles, when they were carrying the coffin, noticed that it's empty, that it's heavy. So they opened the coffin, they discovered a stone, and that's how they knew that she was translated and she is now a divine being, right? And they actually set up the stone in a sacred ground where it now stands in the Heroon of Alcmena in Thebes. So in Thebes, you could actually go visit the stone that was placed by Hermes into the coffin instead of the body that was translated, right? It's just like how in Jerusalem there is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where actually in the church, the entire Passion story is basically contained in the same building, right? So in one corner, you have the exact spot where Jesus was crucified. In another corner in the same building, you have where the tomb is and stuff like that. It's like a small Disneyland, right, of the Passion narrative. Well, that was really common in the ancient world. Like these people who were translated into heaven, they had specific sacred grounds and sacred groves where they were worshipped. Sometimes their tombs were worshipped, in some cases empty tombs, and in some cases you had other things, like a stone that was placed by a god instead of the body that was snatched into the afterlife. Mm. Yeah.
There's
no big deal, you know.
No,
like when Constantine took power, and when he started establishing all of these places of worship, some of them already existed before, like in Bethlehem, probably, maybe even where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is now. But when he funded construction of buildings, places of worship in these things, he wasn't doing anything special. Like this was completely normal for a Roman emperor to do. He funded construction of temples on places that were connected with lives of these deified beings. It's just he had a new one that hasn't had this kind of financial backing yet. So he just did what like other emperors did as well, right? Hadrian, for example, funded constructions of temples in Jerusalem and stuff like that. So again, that fits the culture as well.
Thank you so much for that, guys. Constellation Pegasus, again, I really appreciate the support. Said it once and I'll say it again. People can't even agree if hell exists and who Jesus was. The Bible is horribly written to cause confusion on basics. No way a God could be involved with this mental and emotional cruelty.
I don't know. Like, I don't really think about it this way, right? Like, because some people, how they think about Christianity is it something that you would expect to see if it was actually true? I'm kind of seeing it for just another like religious movement that's coming from this specific area, and how that explains really well even the very detailed like particular features of how these stories are told, how Christians worshipped, how they depicted Jesus in art, like Dionysus, for example, and stuff. So, it fits together. It's not alien to that specific place and that specific period in time, when it just happens to be the location where the actual creator and sustainer of the universe decided to enact this like divine plan, right? And it's so much so that Christian apologists had to come up with apologetics about it, right? Christian Martyr says, well, all of these other translated figures, they were like placed in history as false flag of operations by Satan, so that when the actual Messiah comes, when the actual Son of God arrives, people are going to be more likely to dismiss him because they will think that it's just another repetition of the same trope, right? Which, to be fair, if this is really what Satan did, it's working 100% on me.
Oh, no. Constellation's coming from a form of Christianity I came out of too, more fundamentalist. And so obviously, if you take all of those factors into account, this is absurd. If you're trying to think of it in those ways. So Constellation, yeah, I get where you're coming from. And I get exactly where Camille's coming from as well, where he's just seeing it like it's like an anthropologist finding another fossil. And it's like, oh, yeah, this is part of the Homo erectus.
This is like an analogy that I was thinking about. It's like, imagine you are an archaeologist and you are digging in a location in some, it's some ancient civilization that is long gone. And you find out an idol of a god that has let's say, a bird head, right? So it's like it has ornithomorphic features. And you are thinking, okay, how do I explain why this god is depicted like a bird, like a mixture of human and bird elements? Well, if you know that the civilization that you are working with had gods that look like a bull, a crocodile, a scarabæus, and like other animals, it's not surprising that they are going to have a bird god as well, right? Like, even if this is the first instance that you are going to discover, you will see immediately how it fits into the context, into this religious context. You don't have to like come up with some crazy theories about how the statue came to be found in remnants of this specific civilization, right? It's just another piece of the puzzle. It's not a very good analogy. It's just to illustrate the point.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Derek, did you want to make a comment on that or move to the next one?
Let's move to the next one.
Okay. Constellation back again. Were there any porn gods in antiquity? Hey, guys, some things never change.
Yeah, that's a good question. That would be
well. There was
a topic for it.
Priapus, the dickhead deity.
Yeah, I mean, maybe
we do have.
There's a little delay.
Yep.
No, what is amazing is all the artifacts and artwork that vividly display sexual coitus. I mean, you'll come across that a lot. I've come across that just haphazardly in my researching these topics. You know, different images of in ancient Egypt, and just all throughout the Mediterranean world. Sex itself.
Well, we all know from Isaiah that Yahweh has a really big penis,
Was
right?
highly revered and
There's
very much alive.
Bad delay here, Derek. It's your internet's really struggling.
No, I was just going to say that we know from Isaiah that Yahweh has a large penis, right?
Yeah.
That's not unusual. And there is a video that we could do at some point, because it's like it. For example, in Greek mythology, you have a lot of things that people now would consider rude and inappropriate. Yeah, this is what I'm talking about. That people would now consider rude and inappropriate for gods to do. Like probably the most famous example is the divine conception of Heracles, where Zeus is just enjoying intercourse so much that he extends the night so it lasts 3 times long as usual, because it's just so good. But like the point that I would like to get across when it comes to this is for people to realize that this isn't meant to be pornographic, and this isn't meant to be like obscene or burlesque, right? This wasn't divine pornography. There is a reason why the myth is told in this specific way, and why it makes sense for Zeus to do this, which had to do with how ancient Greeks conceptualized deities and how their piety was. So this, this doesn't mean this isn't supposed to be denigrating. It's just as divine, as just as sacred for ancient Greeks as, for example, the virgin conception of Jesus is for Christians today. It was just a different religious landscape, so people had like different ideas and thought about these things differently, right? Yeah.
Thank you for that, Constellation. We'll try and put a Greek near-death experience show together at some point, for sure. Bring some text and stuff to it, and get people to see that wherever you're from, the way you're programmed, the cultural background, the gods you've been raised to say their names is pretty much the kind of stuff that you're probably going to see in that kind of experience. So, and then Margaret de Velden again here, and then we're caught up. Do you think Mark was inspired to write by an historical Jesus, or more than just accounts of a Jesus? Do you think Mark was inspired to write by an historical Jesus, or more than just accounts of a Jesus? What do you guys think? I mean, do you think that Mark? I mean, I think Mark's writing it's literature. So I don't think this is like, hey, this. Whether one wants to read Mark's mind and imagine he's painting some history that he's created, depending on if you follow like David Litwa's How the Gospels Became History, or if you take other approaches that he's not really writing a history, even though there is a historical guy at the root in which they're portraying this gospel. I imagine that's the approach I would take. But what do you guys think?
I'm not sure if Derek is.
I'm with you 100% in that I think it is the latter. I don't think very much of this in Mark is actually inspired by the historical Jesus.
Did we lose you?
Life and death necessarily. I think that there really is a historical Jesus there at the core. Oh my goodness. Am I still here?
Yeah, you're here. You're here. We lost you for a second, but you're here.
Okay. Yeah. But no, I think that it's. I mean, right in line with what Camille was saying, that there probably is a guy, a guru, a figure with a following, who inspired something. But I think one of the telltale signs is that what we find in Mark and in the Gospels is just it's not there in Paul, hardly any of it. It's not altogether surprising, given that Paul's letters are theological treatises. It's a different genre than Greco-Roman bio-y like we have in the Gospels, but that there would be next to nothing you know, all of these biographical details that we find in the Gospels that just are not present in Paul, not even an empty tomb. I think that this is all just later fictive embellishment. I think this is much of this is Mark's own creative invention.
This is such a circle jerk. I mean, this call or this stream, right? But I'm going to say something that's probably going to surprise people. But like for example, when the Gospel of Mark, and only the Gospel of Mark, by the way, mentions that Simon of Cyrene was the father of Alexander and Rufus, that's a really weird way how to identify a person in the ancient world, right? Because first of all, he's already identified by Simon of Cyrene. Sorry, when he's already identified as Simon of Cyrene, which is enough to identify him. But also, when you are identified in the ancient world by the names of your relatives, it's usually by your names of your parents, right? So it would be Simon, son of someone. So why is it the case that here we have someone being identified by the name of their sons? And there are several explanations, but I kind of think that the best explanation is that the people who were reading the Gospel of Mark, like the original audience, knew who these people are. Which means that, you know, the author of the Gospel of Mark is trying to tell them, oh, you know those guys, Alexander and Rufus? Yeah, it was their dad. Right? So that there were actual people who existed. That's not the only explanation, but I think it works pretty well, actually. And I would even say that there are places in the Gospel of Mark when the author starts naming people by name, even though there isn't any like obvious reason to do that. Like, for example, he names the 12 disciples, right? Even though most of them are not characters in the story. It's just a name and they don't appear. And for example, he names the women at the tomb. There isn't any reason why you need to name them specifically and say, oh, this is Mary, mother of Joseph and James, you know? And I'm thinking, well, the reason why he does that is because, again, these are the people that his audience knows. So the people that heard the Gospel of Mark originally, when it was first written, they knew, oh, that James and that Joseph, well, that was their mom, right? So the author is actually talking about people who really existed in the first century, and he's telling his audience that their relatives were actually there when these events were transpiring, right? I don't know if those people were still alive when the Gospel of Mark was written. I don't know if what the author claims about these people is actually true, but I do think that at least in these cases, you know, they could be actual people who were really there at the crucifixion and so on.
I mean, that's possible. I would think for me, that's personally to me less likely than possible other explanations. I mean, one I think that we don't hear enough is that maybe Mark knows of Josephus. And I imagine maybe some of these characters or historical people we might have seen lifted from there. But the other one is when I look at like that video I sent you of Michael Cashapp, where we talked about names and acts. And I know this is Acts. I understand this is later, but I'm looking at gospel material and seeing them in a similar genre. like they're writing this historical fiction and they're placing names purposefully in here, like Aeneas, Tabitha. These are Roman names. Cornelius, this is a Roman centurion and stuff. I wonder if some of these names are playing a significant role. Kind of like, okay, is Joseph of Arimathea really like this historical guy who actually goes to Pontius Pilate and goes, hey, can we bury this guy properly? And we saw it in that Apologia video that you were part of, where the argument from Dale Allison and from Mike Licona are trying to say, yeah, we have precedents here in Josephus that like Jews would go and like they'd make a big fuss and that therefore they would allow them to bury the body and therefore there's really an empty tomb. And now we have all this like added historical detail. And for me, I'm more like, I'm not saying it's not possible. It could be. But, you know, I wonder if there's other alternative explanations than, hey, these people that they're writing about, they know of these people from this region of Galilee who went with Jesus down to Jerusalem. Is Mark really writing that down into the history here? Or is this like a novel type text that like doesn't really need all that history to it? You know what I mean? I'm very, very skeptical of that approach that you were describing. So
yeah, that's possible too.
Yeah, I don't know. Derek, you seemed like you wanted to say something, then we'll move to the next one.
No, I just think that you're dead on. I think that this is historical fiction. You know, you're taking historical people and places and you're embedding them into a narrative. It's like anyone who's seen James Cameron's Titanic, it's that kind of thing. We know that historically there really was a sunken Titanic. But you can't take that to mean that the story about Jack and Rose is actually historical. So I think it's just that kind of thing.
And not only those specific invented characters. Like in the movie, there are the characters who actually represent real people do things that we don't have attested them doing. Right? Like I think we don't actually. If I'm not mistaken, we don't actually know what happened to the captain. You know, there are different theories, but that's not on the record. But in the movie, it shows you exactly how he died, because of course it's going to do that, right? So the director just picked one option and he depicted it as he put it in the movie. And Titanic is always heralded as one of the best like recreations of actual historical situation in cinema history. It's like very precise, you know, that they get all of the details right. They even had actors who look like the people they are, like physically look like the people they are depicting, right? And nobody would think that because James Cameron deviated from actual historical events is in several respects, that he's lying or he's trying to be deceptive or that he's like, you know, conning people or something like that. And I think this is
creative license.
A limited. Sorry?
Taking creative license.
Yeah, this is what I'm saying, right? Like this is somewhat of an analogy of how I think people in the ancient world wrote, even about actual historical people and actual historical events, right? Like Josephus was a Jew. He thought that the events of the Hebrew Bible actually happened. But when you take the Hebrew Bible and his antiquities and you read it synoptically side by side, he's rewriting it in many cases very, very radically, right? And he has no problem with that, you know. When you take Deuteronomy and you take the biography of Moses by Philo and you read it synoptically, Philo is making shit up about Moses that's not in the actual Bible, which is the only source that you have for the story.
Or creating new historical events, like in Josephus, adding Alexander the Great went and saw Daniel's text and like makes up stuff. So I that's why I brought up the Aeneas thing, because if we take that methodology, I mean, did they know of a guy named Aeneas that was really running around in this region and that, like, of course, he makes up the fact that he's resurrected from the dead? Or is Aeneas a place name? And it's like, when I say Michael Jordan, you think of basketball, Aeneas is like Rome. So when you hear the name Aeneas, the word, the picture, the entire frame of Rome comes to mind. And then Cornelius as a Roman centurion, that comes to mind. Now you're hitting like military leaders, like high up, very important people in the politics of Rome that are all looking at Christianity going, this is the truth. So, and they're innocent, which I think there's a highly like embellished reason to write to Theophilus, who's this probably rich guy. Oh, great, Theophilus. Hey, we're innocent. I know there's been these cases against Christians. Don't worry, join us. We've been innocent every moment. Look at this. Check this guy out. Look at Herod Antipas. Check out how he even, like, they're all seeing that we're innocent. And in fact, you know who's guilty? The Jews. All of that, I think, and there might be the truth that Jews start looking at these Christians and going, guys, stop coming to the synagogue. You guys are just nuts. Quit the crap. And they're like kicking them out. And this becomes this big thing. And they make it more than what it is in the narrative. I'm not saying it's not possible. Some of the people you said may be historical or maybe based on historical people. I wonder if Mark, whoever this person is, I think they're highly educated, are hearing stories about, and then they're creating a fiction in which they're putting place, you know, things like that. So I don't think this would be an argument for me. Why I'm cautious about it is trying to say Mark's writing to an audience that this audience knows these people and place names and things. I would be highly suspect of trying to connect those dots. Is it possible? Sure. I just don't make that leap.
Yeah, I mean, you have to appreciate, like, if this is something that you have to appreciate. So if you get what kind of literature this is and what kind of creative freedom was involved, then you don't have to push back against the idea that the original audience actually knew some of the people who are in it, because that wouldn't be incompatible with the person inventing stuff, right? Like, for example, in the Mosaic biography by Philo, there is always this question of how is it possible that if Deuteronomy was written by Moses, how is it possible that it narrates his own death, right? And people were really, really bothered by it even in the ancient world. And different authors actually try to solve it differently. So in Josephus, and this is something that we already mentioned, that the explanation is that Moses doesn't actually die at all. He's translated into the divine realm. But he writes in Deuteronomy that he died instead. And Philo, in the biography of Moses, takes a different approach. He says that actually what happened is that Moses had, before he died, had a revelation from God which showed him what's going to happen immediately after he dies, so that he can write about it while he is still alive. So, and this is, of course, made up by Philo, right? Like, nobody thinks that Philo had any sources for this. People who were able to read the biography of Moses by Philo would also be able to read Deuteronomy. So everyone would be able to call him on this bullshit, right?
Right.
But nobody did, and this was perfectly fine for Philo to do. He was a pious Jew who invented a divine revelation, right? Completely acceptable, like absolutely within the realm of... Josephus invents new revelations of God or appearances all the time that are not actually in the Hebrew Bible, right? Like, for example, the Egyptian king, Pharaoh, he gets a divine message from God about Moses being born. So an explanation for why he decides to start killing all of the Hebrew kids is that he was actually told that, there is going to be a new king born, right?
And
so
it wasn't just that the Israelites were becoming a big multitude of people.
Right. This is not what Josephus says. Josephus adds a vision that the Egyptian king has as a motivation, right? I don't know why he did it, but it's not in the Hebrew Bible. And like, people who were reading his antiquities, they could go and check and see that he's just inventing this. But nobody bothered, because everyone understood that this is how you write history, right? It's a creative process, and you don't necessarily depict what really happened or what your sources tell you what happened. You depict what's like a plausible reconstruction of the events, like believable reconstruction of the events, right? That's why, for example, when he talks about Enoch, Elijah, and Moses, he depicts them as translated, because that's what people believed in the first century. You know, that's not necessarily what people believed when the actual text of the Hebrew Bible was written, but you know, by the first century, that's how you did it, and that's how all of the other historians do it as well.
Thank you so much for that, Margaret. Thank you for the question. Designs by Maria Emilia. Hope I'm pronouncing your name properly. Thank you for becoming a member recently, of course. I think there are atheists who have more faith in God than believers. The Bible unknowingly becomes their God. I believe the scriptures reveal the true heart. I kind of have a hard for me to sift and understand. Go ahead, Derek.
I think that's probably right. That's kind of right on the nose. I do a lot of suppressing. I do a lot of suppressing of my belief in God as revealed in the scriptures. So I gotta deal with that discomfort. It's kind of like after you've had a few combos from Taco Bell and you wash that down with Starbucks and you're trying to hold that in. I think that there's a little bit of that happening here. Bingo. Tired of being nailed like this. Lord.
I think the perception, right, is starting from a worldview that we're not starting from is like, even a lot of atheists like me, you, Camille, we're weirdos. Derek, we're weirdos because we actually engage with the material. We get immersed in the material. We appreciate the material. We love learning about the material. The more we do that, I guess they would look at it and go, why? Like the question is, it's almost like, why Derek? Why Camille? Why Derek Bennett? Why are you making so much content? And each of us might have a different motivation and reasoning. I feel like my reasoning has changed over time. Initially, it was like cage atheist, kind of like, I just want to show why fundamentalists are wrong because I was wrong and I want to help other people see how much freedom there is in recognizing that these are human documents and things like that and not literally divine as we once did. Now it's more of a historical quest. Now I'm actually quite fascinated with understanding why people believed the way they did, how they believed, what are some of the stories. You know, I think it's kind of cool. Kind of like some people might be into comic books or they figure out about like X-Men universe. They get lost in certain things. I do that with history because I think there's real history here. What people really believe this. I mean, we had kings that ruled the planet, most of the planet, at least the Roman Empire and stuff that believed in stuff like this that we're talking about and why. And I also do it now that I believe that evolution's the case to study. I think these texts are kind of written fossils to see how we once thought and where we are today. And I am so fascinated with this now. Even with the idea that I am a primate. I did not believe I was a fallen creature, not a rising creature. And knowing that difference to me has changed my world. So I think that Maria's coming from that other side, if that makes sense, and is saying, you guys are really into this stuff. You have more faith in God than many believers, you know?
Yeah, you have to understand. You have to understand this is part and parcel of our lives and our upbringing. I mean, I'm from Southern Indiana here in the U.S. My mother was a devout Christian, and I still cherish the memory I have when I was a child, and she would read to me at night from an illustrated children's Bible. Her Bible was just marked through underlinings all throughout with amens to the side and whatnot. This is something I grew up with, and it had an impression upon me. It is part of my heritage and upbringing, and so of course I'm going to take an active interest in it, even as I've walked away from it. There were. Sure, like early on in that sort of quote unquote angry atheist phase, it becomes a matter of debunking, right? And there's still a lot of that goes on in my work, but it is not merely about debunking. It is about genuinely, seeking after understanding, taking an active, genuine interest in where these ideas come from, how they originated, how they developed. So of course I'm fascinated. I want to peel away the layers of that belief system with which I was raised to come to have a more enlightened understanding of it. Absolutely.
Well put. Camille, did you want to comment on this?
Yeah, do you want to hear my testimony?
Yeah, tell me.
Well, I mean, I'm different, right? Because I happen to be born in a country that has been measured as the least religious in the world. And it's actually very difficult for people to realize what that exactly means. Here in the public life, religion is invisible, doesn't exist. There are theists, about 30% of them, but an overwhelming majority of them, you will never be able to tell. Like, I have friends who believe in God, and I only found out after knowing them for like 10 years because of something they said or something, right? Or they mentioned that they go to church or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And like a vast majority of people who believe in God here, by like US standards, are the most liberal, wishy-washy Christians that you can imagine. Like a vast majority of them, even though they nominally belong to like a Roman Catholic Church, they don't buy any of the supernatural shit, right? They are theists for like social, pragmatic reasons, stuff like that, right? They wouldn't buy in a second that you could actually videotape Jesus's resurrection if you had a time machine,
Right.
So, and the way or the story that I tell to myself about why I'm interested in this is that, like, when I was a teenager, I was really interested in science fiction. And why I was specifically interested in depictions of different ways of thinking, right? So I didn't like stories where there is very exotic environments and technology, but the way how the characters think and how they operate is essentially the same as people do today. Like, for example, my favorite sci-fi novel is Solaris by Stanislav Lem, and that's because it has an alien that is the most alien of all of science fiction, and it's fascinating. Like, the whole book is about how it's a thing, but it's so completely different from people that you can't even say whether it's a living being, and you can't even say whether it's a mind. And that's why it's so interesting, right? But at some point, I would say around 2014, I realized that, okay, sci-fi is cool, but the problem is that it's still made up by people who are from like 21st century, right? So it's artificial. And then I started reading some like ancient literature, like Epic of Gilgamesh, Herodotus, and stuff like that. And I discovered that this is actually the real shit, right? This is the real stuff. These are actually people who thought about, they look at the world completely differently. Right. And this is like chef's kiss, right? That's what I want to experience, That's what I enjoy. And like, I hang out in, for example, with Nathan Ormond on Digital Gnosis channel in these like open hangouts. When they are theists, I almost never push back against them. And I try to just have a normal conversation and maybe try to figure out what they believe. And like, the crazier shit they believe, the more interesting it is for me. So I like feel zero incentive to debunk it or push back against it or like get them to change their mind. Mm-hmm. Because the more alien or the more like dissimilar it is from how I view the world, the more value it has. And this is why I'm interested in ancient literature, including Christian, Jewish, Greco-Roman literature, because in a way they are the real aliens, right? They are as close to beings that actually come from a different planet as you can get. And that's really interesting.
Wow, that was an interesting testimony there. I really appreciate the question, Maria. Is there any particular Greek demigod whose conception is most like that of Jesus in narrative? Greek
I
demigod.
think we all know the answer.
I would point to a couple, because in a lot of these instances, you do have, the child or the demigod is gotten some kind of sexual activity involved, whereas you don't have that in the Gospels. But there are a few cases. I think Plutarch discusses how Plato was birthed by Perictione, with Apollo, the high god Apollo, being his father, and that it was from the pneuma of God, the Spirit of God, the indwelling. He says it's not impossible for a god to have the spirit of a god to have generative, something to that effect, to bring about generation in a woman. So it appears to be that Apollo, simply by the spirit, impregnates Perictione with Plato. Somewhat similar with, oh my goodness, I'm trying to think of the golden shower, with the Virgin Danae. She gives birth to who? I think it's Perseus. Perseus here, yeah. The something to the effect of that golden shower is sort of, something comparable to the pneuma or to the spirit. Zeus takes that form and thereby impregnates Danae without being in an explicitly sexual affair in which he's literally having sex with Danae. And then in the story of, oh my goodness, Aeschylus, where he talks about it is simply by the breath of Zeus that he impregnates the woman in that tale, where impregnation simply by the spirit of a god.
Derek, we got most of that, but I will say there are moments where you're breaking out, and someone was wondering, don't know if this has worked for you in the past, if refreshing and coming back in, if that would help with the internet or not. Don't know.
I'll give that a shot.
Just figure I'd throw it your way, because your lips, face aren't even moving with your audio, and there's a huge delay and stuff. Camille, did you want to answer?
I'll step out and come right back.
Okay, brother.
Yep.
It's actually funny because people in the chat are giving different names, and I think that's very telling, because there are like individual examples of these other figures are going to be more or less similar to like particular aspects of the Gospels or even particular sections.
Right.
So Derek, for example, mentioned that the conception of Jesus, there are like very close parallels. David Litva in Jesus Deus has this really nice example of Plutarch, like the way, but in the 2nd century, the way how Plutarch talks about divine conception is very, very similar to how Luke talks about it, probably at the same time. It's no longer appropriate for these gods to rape women, so they impregnate them through pneuma, dynamis, and stuff like that.
And notice the male goes to, anyway, I won't get lost in the details. I recommend everybody read it.
But then, like, other aspects are going to be similar to different examples. So if you take like appearance narratives in the Gospels, something that's really similar narratively is the appearance of Romulus to Proclus, right? Where he appears to him, declares what happens to him, and gives him instructions about what the Romans need to do now. And then there are like other parallels to Dionysus. What I want to say is, we should probably ask this question to early Christian apologists and see which specific divine beings they point to when they say, oh, Jesus, he's just like these guys.
Mm-hmm.
So if you believe in them, you should believe in Jesus as well, or at least you shouldn't oppose it, right? And who they name? They name Heracles, they name Asclepius, they name Dionysus, and they name Roman emperors. So I would probably say in their minds, in minds of early Christians in the 2nd, 3rd century, these were the best parallels, right, to the story of Jesus in the pagan world. And one last thought is, it's also very important to realize that what we are not saying is that there is like deliberate copying necessarily going on in Christianity. We are not saying that at some point Jesus, Peter, Paul, or someone decided, oh, we are just going to bootleg like a specific existing figure and we are going to make our own version. Because this is something that sometimes even atheists or like non-Christians think, that, oh, it's just a copy, it was an imitation, it was a part of a conspiracy or deception or something like that. That's not what we are saying. What we are saying is that these ideas were just so common and so prevalent in the ancient world that you don't need to explain it by like conscious direct imitation and copying. It's just like, it's not surprising that someone today makes up a superhero because we live in a culture that's so, now it's so popular that, and you know, let's say that you have a comic book artist who makes up a new superhero. Can you say that he's imitating Superman or Batman or Iron Man? You know, depending on how the superhero behaves, what are his superpowers and stuff like that, you could say that there is like it's more similar to this or that,
right?
But it doesn't really make sense to say that this is a copy, right?
And
unless
even,
it's really
and I'll say this just to go deeper into what you're saying, even if there are seemingly influences that come more from certain figures, whether it be Caesars, whether it be a particular deity. I think the turning water into wine might play a significant role with Dionysus. Even if there seems to be influence, right? More from certain comic book figures, let's use that analogy to keep going. Where we have a problem, and I think why you find atheists doing that, 2 reasons. Usually they probably aren't aware of the scholarship, which is why it's important that we educate people on both sides of the spectrum. But number 2 is this: they're fighting a certain fight. And the fight that they're fighting is literally the polar opposite of the position they're taking. See, there's much nuance in what you and me are describing here. Their fight is against people who are saying nothing influenced Jesus. Jesus is so separate, so wholly different, and had no influence from other gods. Like, they pretend that this didn't grow up in a zeitgeist in a time where this is exactly what you expect. John Dominic Crossan debated a Muslim scholar once. He told the guy, if Muhammad was born in the 1st century and he wasn't claiming to be a son of God, he would not be anybody special. Nobody would have gave 2 craps about Muhammad at all in the 1st century. But because he was born in a certain time, this is when this thing rises up. That's why you see it the way you do. So we're fighting typically this battle of the extremes on both ends. This is not a comic book. This is the real deal. Batman really is located in Arkham, and he really does have powers to do this. And you're going, and what's happening in the opposite, they go, no. Batman was inspired by an earlier form, and they stole it from this other comic book. And it's like, okay, when you get deeper into it, like you're saying, you find out, like, dude, this is the genre. This is the world that they lived in. And so I'm glad you said this, Camille, because I think this is important that we let others both know. Christians, please stop with this absolutism that you have no influence, that the culture and the world Jesus literally comes up out of and the Gospels come up out of have no context. The more you do that, the more people are going to see the BS that you're saying there, and you're going to create monsters opposed to that. And I say monsters because, you know what I mean? Like, they're going to be against you. They're going to fight you, but they're going to go to the other end. So you're creating also an empire of people that are going to be fundamentalist in the opposite direction. So we're trying to create balance.
Yeah, and I already mentioned Inspiring Philosophy has a video series where he goes through these examples of like dying and rising gods and stuff like that, and he deconstructs he points out that some of the parallels don't actually exist, or they are misrepresented and stuff like that. Like, there are things that I could, as someone who actually studies classics, there are things that I could point in these videos that are like not true, or it's not what the scholars think and stuff like that. But overall, I think the series is good in that it's like a good pushback against this kind of bad, uninformed, like anti-Christian or non-Christian argumentation, right? So I would actually think that of all of his content, this is something that I really like, and I like almost approve of it, because what the goal of the video is legitimate, the project is legitimate, and what he is trying to say and what he's trying to do is something that really needs to be said and done, right? And of course, like, there are things I think he says that are not true. But when I rewatch some of my older videos, I discover that I said something that I now think isn't probably true. So that happens to everyone. By the way, I need to take a bio break for 2 minutes, so
Yeah.
feel free to answer more super
We'll
chats.
we'll keep pushing on. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that, Doug. And this is being fun. Remind me, Derek, we got to touch the topic of dying and rising gods. At least we need to deal with the category of death, because I think that's also everyone experiences death in some sense. Or at least mere mortals typically, unless they're being taken, right? There are accounts where people are taken before they die. But it might be important to bring up this category. So just remind me. Margaret, again, thank you. When God got angry because Adam and Eve knew their nakedness, would God also have been naked? I assume so. I don't know.
I mean, that has never even occurred to me.
It is funny, right?
Yeah. I don't know. That's a good question.
I mean, it is a bad thing when Noah's son sees Noah's nakedness. And is this a euphemism for, as some want to try to argue, that his son actually raped his dad, right? Like, you kind of wonder, is there a rape here? Or a sex act that's happened, right? So if nakedness in this context is a euphemism for sex act, then this can play into the part why even later Gnostics and others that are going on are saying that deed that happened in the garden was a sex act, and that God saw their nakedness. This is why there was a sex act, a euphemism for some form of sex act that should not have happened. And I like, various scholars have different points of view, but if Adam is a godlike figure, he's not like immortalized, but he's a godlike figure. And God knows that, hey, they've eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they've repopulated now. So now we've got all these other godlike figures that are starting to come on the scene. Get them out before they eat one of the tree of life, before they live forever and they repopulate forever. That's going to be a problem for us. We're going to have a population control issue here in the Garden of Eden. We can't have that. Get them out. And I don't know. There's various ways of looking at this, but we see the mythology continue with nakedness and sex in the garden being the problem. And many Christians even tried to wrestle with this. Hey, look, we got to stop having sex because that's the original sin. There's an issue here. And then others who are saying, women only get saved through bearing children. You better keep popping kids out, girls. There's spectrums in Christianity on how this worked out.
But I also think much of Genesis, especially there in the beginning, is an etiological tale. It's meant to explain the origins of various things, like why do we labor? Why do we die? Why is it that snakes don't have legs? At some point in our history, we found it necessary to clothe ourselves and to hide our private parts. And this is an etiological tale that's meant to explain why and how that came about.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, that's probably true. Also, there are like a couple of things that might make people think, might help people see the story differently, right? So the Garden of Eden probably is meant to be the place where the gods live, because in the story there are multiple gods, Elohim, plural, you know. We know that, for example, because there are 4 streams that flow from the Garden of Eden, and that's like streams flow from mountains. So it's probably meant to be a mountain. And in Near Eastern tradition, and also in Greek tradition, gods often reside in mountains. Like there is a different Semitic tradition which depicts gods residing specifically on a mountain. It names the streams, and 2 of them are the same as in Genesis, right?
Mhm.
So you have basically Mount Olympus. Like it's a Near Eastern version of Mount Olympus. It's a place where the gods reside. It's a garden. They have a very nice place, right? Because if you are living in the desert and you are like a king, or you're imagining like a ruler, it kind of makes sense to depict them living in a garden, because that's a very luscious environment that's very difficult for you to have. The gods don't want to work, which is again a trope that happens in Near Eastern creation myths. That the reason why humans are created is because gods don't actually want to work. So in Genesis, gods create Adam and Eve, Adam first and then Eve, in order to take care of the garden, to take care of the manual labor. Like they are the Mexicans of this divine place, right? And that's why it's important to keep them from eating from the 2 trees, which are the immortality and divinity granting food. So in this garden, in this Mount Olympus, you don't have ambrosia and nectar, you have 2 trees. And if someone eats from both, they become a divine being, because they have immortality and they have moral knowledge. And that are the 2 things that define a god, right? So that's why Yahweh like prevents, and it even says, oh, Yahweh created them, or Elohim created them in the image of Elohim, male and female. Why does it say male and female? Well, because some Elohim are male and some Elohim are female, you know. So when there have been like thousands of years of theological discussions about what does it mean for a person to be created in the image of God. Like, what exactly is being meant? Is it like moral knowledge, free will? No, it tells you in Genesis 2. It means male and female. The image of God is a body shape. It's the body plan. Because some gods that live in the garden are male and some gods are female. That's why you have these 2 biological sexes, right? And of course, when they eat from the first tree, what does God say? Well, we need to kick them out before they eat from the other tree, and they complete the transformation into a divine being. That's what's happening in the story, basically. That's my hot take.
Okay. Yeah. Appreciate that question. Good question, Margaret. I don't think I ever thought about that nakedness thing in Genesis that way. Germania, thank you for the super chat, my friend. Really appreciate it. I don't always comment, but I always try to listen, watch the playback. And he says, oh, and I hit that thumbs up button like it was going out of style. And he meant to say, subscribe to the guest channels and watch their streams and lives and like their comments and to put all that. But, you know, Ger just didn't have enough space to really say everything that he really thought. Ger, thank you so much for the super chat. Really appreciate that. And for showing up in the chat. Go subscribe to Germania, actually, because he's doing stuff over there on his channel as well. And there's a lot of stuff he's trying to do. Debates, things like that are happening over there. Go show him some love. Designs by Maria Emilia. Thank you so much for that super chat. Really appreciate the support. I'm referring to the Bible being a God to believers, religious ones. A person's heart reveals the truth about people. Having a love for understanding Scripture is beautiful regardless of belief. I hope that makes sense. I love it. I love it.
Yeah, it's some of my favorite literature is like Christian or Jewish literature. It beats like going through Second Analytics by Aristotle is extremely painful compared to reading, for example, Ecclesiastes, you know?
Right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Maria. And we are due a conversation next week sometime. I'll make it happen for sure for joining the tier on my membership program. and helping support our channel. So we are due an hour conversation. We're going to make that happen. I really appreciate it. Dying and rising gods, guys. Before we wrap the stream up, we've been tiptoeing around this subject, this issue, and while I hear some scholars say, look, that category, the way that it has been defined is just not a proper way of definition. And then I hear like this super overemphasis on Christianizing context of words and stuff like that. However, like earlier today, we talked about resurrection, right? And I have John Dominic Crossan on, and he explains resurrection is a specifically Jewish term, but it emphasizes much more than just the Jewish idea of, in the end, there's going to be a final resurrection of all of the dead, which is Jewish, may have come earlier from Zoroastrianism or some form of Persian thought. Who knows? I think there's probably something to that. The point is we were willing to see a category here, even if they're not identical Xerox copies, like we've seen with the Zeitgeist movie. And when I used the term Zeitgeist earlier, I did not mean it in the terms of that show. I meant it in the terms of a pocket of time in which things are happening in history and a culture in a particular window. But this category we describe of gods who die and are resurrected, or in some sense, people who die and then are ascending on high. Derek, I'm going to leave this up to you, because there was debate discussion in previous time with you and Christine Hansen on this issue, where when I had a phone conversation with Christine, it was like, Christine actually thinks there's a category you can parallel things, but the Xerox copy stuff is an issue, and being careful of how we parse the discussion is very important. But you being someone who knows this, and then Camille, maybe you have some pushback or difference of opinion, or maybe you see and agree with Derek on this. Let's talk about dying and rising gods, or at least this issue.
Well, so there's been a lot of criticism over the years of how James George Frazer, how he approached this in the Golden Bough many years ago, and he seems to have conceptualized this as just a single definitive category, that there was the dying and rising God, and I guess implied that Jesus was just another one of these, which is not quite right. That perhaps overgeneralizing a bit. And Jonathan Z. Smith in late 80s, early 90s, he really took Frazer to task for this, and just kind of exploded, at least seemingly exploded, his entire thesis. And that really, you can break this down into two categories. Gods who don't actually die but disappear for some time and then return, or gods that die and simply stay dead. So that's really all we're dealing with. And nowadays, more recent scholarship shows that you really needn't go to either two of these extremes. If Frazer had gone to one extreme, Jonathan Z. Smith appears to have gone to the other by saying that there's nothing of relevance or accuracy to this at all. So John Granger Cook's Empty Tomb, Resurrection, Apotheosis, which Camille mentioned earlier, he pretty well vindicates a good deal of this and says that, yeah, there absolutely is a kind of a general category of dying and rising gods, divinities who experience various vicissitudes followed by a triumph or victory of some sort, and that in many of these cases it is a death followed by some kind of resurrection, rebirth, or exaltation. And I was just looking recently at it's a great article on academia.edu from this Nathan Nadeau, Nadeau, from the McMaster Journal of Theology and Ministry. It's titled Greek Resurrection Beliefs and the Resurrection of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, Contexts for Consideration. One of those contexts is this whole dying, rising God type thing. And he draws upon the work of John Granger Cook's Empty Tomb, Resurrection, Apotheosis, and agrees that, yeah, this absolutely is a valid category. One of the distinctions made by J.Z. Smith that has been upheld for good reason is the distinction between analogy and genealogy. So an analogical similarity, when we talk about analogies, we're simply saying that there is a striking similarity here without necessarily implying that anything has been borrowed or copied or anything like that. One could say that it's just kind of cut from the same cloth of the sort of mythic consciousness of the times. And then, of course, there are genealogies, genealogical similarities, in which we can tell that there probably has been some kind of actual influence, some kind of genetic relationship, that they're tied, they're linked together in some way, whether that be a kind of direct borrowing or whether it's just influence via cultural diffusion. A lot of these ideas they would circulate and they would be adopted and adapted by different cultures, even making the transfer from one culture to another, such as from ancient Egypt into the Greco-Roman world, into the wider Mediterranean. Ideas were adopted and adapted there, or the Jews during the Hellenistic age, in which they adopted and adapted certain ideas there as well. And I think one can, such as I do in my presentation on resurrection and apotheosis in pre-Christian antiquity, I categorize these a little bit differently, in which I talk about sort of the dying and rising vegetation gods and the apotheosized heroes and kings and divinities in the Greco-Roman world. I do draw a distinction between them, but I'm not sure that you can divorce them entirely, at least not entirely. For instance, Osiris can both be categorized as a dying and rising god, but he also fits within that category of apotheosized heroes as well, and that his resurrection, he becomes, as all ancient Egyptians did when they're raised from death, they literally become a god and they are exalted into the heavens. Royce Scalf has a great article, Becoming God in Ancient Egypt. That was the whole idea, just as it was in the Greco-Roman world, that one was deified and became a god and joined the other gods in the heavens, in Aru. So there is some overlap there, actually, and I don't think that you can divorce the two entirely, although it is probably important to delineate the two categories to a certain extent.
Yeah, that was very nuanced. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so my hot take on the dying and rising God concept. Well, I think that it's too ambitious, and as a result, it stretches the evidence a little too thin. And also it means that you have only a small number of examples. What we have been talking about today and what I've been talking about on other places recently is much more conservative, it's much more minimalistic, and as a result, you get many, many more examples, dozens, and the examples are much closer together, right? So it's much more homogeneous group. The issue that I see with the dying and rising gods is that you postulate some kind of suffering. It could be death, but doesn't have to be. There is a victory over death as a result of that suffering. And then there is supposed to be like a salvific concept or salvific notion that the deity shares the victory over death with the followers. and that's supposed to secure some kind of better improved afterlife. And then there is also this notion that these dying and rising gods were originally agricultural deities. So originally it was about fertility and about saving the crops, or like securing harvest, right? And as the Mediterranean became more urbanized, and as these small, tightly knit agricultural communities became large cities that were anonymized, people no longer knew each other and stuff like that, it transformed from this immediate concern about fertility of the crops into this more individual concern about the afterlife of like one specific person, not about the survival of the agricultural community. My understanding is that experts on Greek and Roman religions now think that a lot of these examples of divine beings that are usually categorized as dying and rising gods, and the various rituals and traditions that they have, are not a really good fit into this kind of framework. So they think that the evidence isn't there. Some of the rituals that look like they are fertility rituals were actually about something else, and stuff like that. Another thing that I want to say is because it's overambitious, you get only a small number of examples, and it just happens to be the case that all of them are fictional, right? So there might be a tendency to emphasize the dying and rising God concept, because that's a way how to argue for Jesus mythicism, right? Because we don't have any examples of people who actually existed. I don't know why Romulus is a dying and rising god, but for example, Caesar Augustus isn't, because specifically in the 1st century BCE and in the 1st century CE, there was a program, like a cultural and political program of depicting Romulus a certain way. That, like, for example, when Greeks and Roman sources talk about Romulus and about his life and ascension, they do it in a certain way so that it lines up with the emerging cult of the Roman emperor as a god or a son of God, right? So what these sources say about Romulus and what they then go on to say about Caesar Augustus, Julius Caesar, Livia Augusta, and stuff like that is very similar, because it's like a propagandistic movement to boost this deification of the emperor. Because for Romans, that was a big deal, right? They were not used to worshiping their leaders as gods. So they had to be like, their minds had to be lubricated. And one of the ways to do that was through this myth of Romulus. And if you actually look at the accounts of Romulus and you line it up with Caesar Augustus, I don't see any reason why, if Romulus is a dying and rising god, why Caesar Augustus isn't one as well. Because in ancient sources, in specifically 1st century sources, Augustus is depicted as a son of a god. So his father was a god. He goes through suffering because he goes through a civil war. He wins the civil war. So he conquers the imminent destruction of the empire. So he's a political savior just as much as Romulus is a political savior. He founds Rome again, essentially. He goes through the turmoils of like securing the continuous existence of Rome. Then he ascends to heaven. And just like there was a story of Proculus, who had an appearance of Romulus, there were specific people who testified before the Roman Senate that they also saw Caesar Augustus ascending to heaven. And they gave like a formal testimony and stuff like that. So I would like someone to explain to me why Romulus is a dying and rising god, but Caesar Augustus isn't, right? But that aside, if you go with divine translation instead of the dying and rising god, you get dozens and dozens of examples. I have now about 70. And it actually turns out that there are a lot of people who actually existed and were believed to undergo divine translation, like Caesar Augustus. And what you discover also, and this is what Red pilled direct to Jesus' historicity agnosticism from full-on mythicism, is that when you categorize these people, depending on when they are depicted as living, then you find out that all of the fictional characters are depicted as living in a very, very distant past, before or around the Trojan War, when everyone depicted as living then was fictional, whether they were translated or not. But when you have people who are depicted as living, around the first century and interacting with known historical figures like Pilate, Caiaphas, John the Baptist, and so on, they almost always existed. There are some exceptions, like the story of Kalirhoe takes place in 5th century BCE Syracuse. So it's not, very distant past, and she's fictional. But that's about the only counterexample, right? So when you start looking at this divine translation concept, it's much more economic. You get better match with evidence and internally, like internal coherence. You get many more examples, and you start getting people who actually existed. So you don't fall for Jesus mythicism that easily.
Derek? I mean, I could comment, but let me say something ecumenical in this here. So between both of what you're suggesting here, I think there could be an overlap. And remember, now we're creating categories that may not be actual categories in real history. What I'm trying to say is, I spoke to Paula Fredrickson recently when I was over there in Boston. And I don't recommend going to Boston if you're not a city person, because goodness. But I asked her, what's the deal with religion? Tell me about Judaism. Tell me about, and she's like, all of those categories we have created. We made these boxes. And she said, these boxes are wrong, wrong, wrong. She said, but we need to use them. We don't have other options. We have to do it in order to try and explain what we're trying to say, but all of them are faulty and they all fall apart at some point. So I see this as dying and rising gods as a category will fall apart. Mm-hmm. Is there overlap between what you're actually saying, Camille, and the category of deities in some sense that die and rise, or in some way come back or still live on, or whatever it might be? Even salvific ones. Kind of take, for example, Herodotus, book 494 to 96, something like that. I can't remember exactly the reference, but he talks about Zalmoxis, right? And I do think this is quite an interesting little cult. And even Herodotus acts like Zalmoxis was a real dude, in this weird Gittai group, believed that they were sending people into the afterlife when they threw them up and had them land on their spears. And if you didn't die, then the gods weren't happy, or you weren't being a good person. It was actually a good thing that you died and that you went and brought this message to the underworld. But then he disappears, right? Here we are with this disappearing thing. But then he comes back after 3 years. It's not 3 days, it's 3 years. And he says at this dinner meal that they have, you will live on. You will have life forever. That's why I was saying there's that book called Coming Back to Life. And there are various scholars in there, some Christian, some non, but they all kind of talk about this coming back to life, and even Greek hero cults and stuff. So I'm trying to find common ground, and I think we're both on common ground here ultimately. And I'm just thinking go ahead.
No, I think that if you remove the eschatological angle, or the salvific angle, and you remove the agricultural stuff, then I think that all of these dying and rising gods are going to be a subset of these divine translation stories. It's just there is many, many more examples of these divine translation stories than there are of dying and rising gods, right? And Zalmoxis is super interesting, for example, because apparently the Getae were monotheists, right? Because
it sounds
Herodotus says explicitly that they think that the only deity that actually exists is Zalmoxis, right? And there are scholars who think that, what happened with these barbarians in Thrace? It's located in Thrace, right? So it's the northern coast of the Aegean Sea. You know what happened around the same period of time? Darius went through the region with a Persian army, on his campaign against the Scythians, and he actually conquered Thrace. Like before the Xerxes' invasion to Greece, there already was a Persian province or satrapy in Europe that was Greece, and this is pretty much where these Getae were located. So some scholars actually think that this might be influenced by Zoroastrianism, weirdly enough, which would be like, completely out of place in like a different location. But the problem with the account of Zalmoxis in Herodotus is like, it's amazing.
Yeah.
It's probably the most detailed account of Zalmoxis that we have. I think otherwise you will only get like 1 or 2 sentences per like an ancient work. The problem is that we don't actually know what the worshippers of Zalmoxis believed. What we have in Herodotus is a Greek debunk, right? So it's basically a version of the kinds of things that the Jews in the 1st century were saying about Jesus. Like, oh, he wasn't actually a son of God, he was a son of Pantera, right? This Roman soldier. Oh, he didn't actually resurrect, the disciples stole his body. This is the only thing, like for Zalmoxis, this is the only thing that we have. We have a Greek counter-apologetic, and from that, we can reverse engineer or reconstruct what the original story was. So I think he didn't hide in like an underground chamber, which is what Herodotus says. I think he probably descended into the underworld. He learned how to achieve immortality there, or some kind of like exalted afterlife. He returned from the underworld 3 years later, and he shared the secret with the Getae. And then they had some kind of communal meal in which they talked about it. Maybe they ritualistically replayed these events, right? Reenacted these events, because a lot of these rituals are reenactments of what's happening in mythology. And the reason why it says in Herodotus that he was a slave of Pythagoras, that was a way for Greeks to connect him to an already known and well understood Greek figure who also talked about the afterlife in this kind of way, right? Because in 5th century, by the 5th century, really one of the only few Greek philosophers who had like radically non-orthodox, non-traditional ideas about the afterlife was Pythagoras, or he was like a good candidate. So if you are trying to undermine this story that the barbarians are talking about, and you want to debunk it from your Greek worldview, it makes sense to say that actually this idea isn't original to this guy. He was just a runaway slave who escaped from Pythagoras, and that's where these beliefs are coming from, right? So it's actually a way how to make the story.
It's like Justin Martyr saying Jesus, well, he looks like these other guys in a way. And it makes me wonder, like, because there's some overlap, right? There has to be a category that even in his mind, he sees Pythagoras and Zalmoxis' faith has, even if they're not genealogically directly connected. There seems to be commonality. That's why he might have fictionally attached him to Pythagoras.
No, I think it's pretty clear. Like the reason why Zalmoxis in this Greek interpretation is connected to Pythagoras is because the Getae had like very strange ideas about the afterworld. Like they probably didn't believe that when you die, you just go to Hades and you stay there until you disappear, like your psyche dissipates, right? They believe that you are, like Herodotus says, they think they are immortal. They think they don't die. And of course they like die as normal people. So probably what he means is that they believe that after you die, you go on existing in a place or in a way which is very different from what the Greeks believe. So if you have that concept and you're trying to tie it to something that you know as a Greek, one obvious connection that you can make is to Pythagoras, because Pythagoras believed in metempsychosis. He believed in reincarnation, which is another very different, very unorthodox way of looking at the afterlife that was available for Greeks to use by the 5th century. by the time where Herodotus is writing. So I think it's pretty clear where this connection is made.
Yeah. Derek, I was just thinking of Valhalla too. Like there's weird Nordic type afterlives and stuff that you just kind of go, what? Derek, tell me what you think. I'm trying to paint a common bridge here the best I could to try and understand the categories and things. But what do you think about and everything that we've been saying here before we...
Well, I mean, it must be said that I have a great deal of admiration for Camille's work, and I think that he is 99.99% on point with all of this, and I think it's okay, and it's perfectly healthy for he and I to have a little bit of disagreement, actually. That's fine. But I do think, actually, Camille, that you're missing a big piece of the puzzle here. I really do. I think you said a lot when you mentioned dying and rising gods within the context of Jesus mythicism. So, this is kind of like if we're talking about comparative religion, and that gets associated with or tied into zeitgeist. And so merely by association, it gets a bad rep when it really shouldn't. The dying, rising God thing, you find that discussed a lot within the literature of mythicism, and that's almost unfortunate to a degree, because it does not by any means necessitate or entail mythicism at all. Take a look, for instance, at the words of S.G.F. Brandon, brilliant scholar and a comparative religions guru, and he talks about with Osiris in particular, the image was that of a divine hero who had suffered and died and then rose from the dead. Thus, Osiris was not some remote transcendent deity such as Re, the sun god, but one who had endured the grim ordeal that awaited all men. In his image, moreover, the Egyptian devotees saw also the promise of their own resurrection from death and eternal life in the realm of Osiris. Phenomenologically, if not historically, Osiris was thus a prototype of Christ. When we look at, I had mentioned Nathan Nadel's work here on academia.edu, where he talks about the relevance of these different categories and of the various myths from the ancient world for the New Testament. And under there, he's got an entire subheading here, Divine Resurrections and Human Hopes, from Osiris to Dionysus. Again, to give you the title, it's Greek Resurrection Beliefs and the Resurrection of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, Contexts for Consideration, Nathan Nadeau. And from John Granger Cook, he says here that his comprehensive survey of the deities in question indicates fairly clearly that the category of dying and rising gods is still useful to describe the vicissitudes of a number of ancient divinities, and thus the thesis that the concept is dead cannot be justified. Just as the Greek of the LXX in New Testament has its place in the matrix of classical Greek, so the resurrection of Christ can be placed in the matrix of bodily resurrections of cult figures from the Mediterranean world. There is, Camille, you yourself mentioned that in all of this, when it comes to the dying and rising divinities, and how originally these were tied to the death and rebirth of the crops, to vegetational and solar cycles and so forth, that was their original meaning. It did come to mean more than that, sort of in the human sphere, having these sort of salvific connections and so forth. I just got a warning that my battery's going out on the phone. Let me reconnect this real quick here. You guys still hearing me?
Yeah.
I think this is massively important for understanding what's going on in the New Testament and in the earliest texts that we have, which are Paul's letters, in which that is very much the idea idea is that the Christian initiate, through the rite of baptism, is being identified with Christ in his death and resurrection, that they are undergoing this sort of ritual assimilation. And that is, I mean, there is a long, long heritage, long tradition of this going back as far as the 3rd millennium BC in the pyramid texts, and then democratized over time, so that practically every ancient Egyptian who could afford at least the minimum essentials could undergo the same process, to where in death they're identified with Osiris, so that they can be raised just as he was. And by the time that we get to Hellenism, in the Hellenistic age, we see that this is brought, this retrojected into the present, to where the initiate can have that identification with the risen God here in this life, so that they're already walking in the presence of that association, experiencing this salvation here and now, and that they can look forward to the culmination of all of that when they finally do die and they're raised as a God into the heavens. So this kind of soteriological, mystical aspect is something that is of paramount importance in this sort of dying, rising God scheme, and that we see, I think, the presence of that very much in these early New Testament texts. Can we draw necessarily a direct genealogical derivation there? I don't know, but the coincidence is such that it's almost difficult not to see some kind of influence via cultural diffusion, however that may be.
You know what? I'm not going to push back against that at all.
Because it could be the case. I mean, there's, yeah, you know, and
No,
this
I mean, it's fair. Yeah.
I like this because Derek is this weirdo, right? This totally strange, goofy, weird guy, right? That I know from the internet world. But he's actually a historicist. And this really brings, I think, some good balance to the table. I mean, he walks away with me and he just, yeah, there was a guy. Like, yeah, we both think there was a guy, but we also see the weird alien, Camille, to use your language, this alien that, like, why is this historical guy getting? And this is one of the one-ups that you always hear mythicists use in arguments. It's like, look at the mystery cults. On Isis, Osiris, Pymanderes, and like the various mystery cults. And look, these are all of gods, right? These deified deities, like way back in ancient times. Jesus has common language. Doesn't this prove he doesn't exist? Not necessarily. And we're trying to like balance it and be fair wherever the data takes us. I could see how someone might get caught up in such detail in the Jesus movement that they like ignore the broader context and they look at this with such historicist eyes. Like, I'll give you an example. Here's another thing I'm sympathetic to in my recent conversation with Richard Carrier on the historical Jesus. I'm sympathetic, doesn't mean I'm fully convinced. I'm open to this idea that there was a pre-existent notion within biblical literature of a suffering Messiah figure, right? We see it in Daniel. We see, at least Isaiah seems to be interpreting it as Israel, but it gets reinterpreted as time goes by to be the individual or the Messiah or whatever. And my point is like, this is why I'm sympathetic and saying, I know that this gives Richard and mythicists some clout. And they go, see, if we already have the category of a dying figure, why couldn't we invent him whole cloth? And I say, why couldn't a guy have been nutty enough to follow his scripture and actually get killed? Like, so we can both take these categories and rule out it doesn't prove one or the other. It could be used for one or the other. And I would say the same goes for the whole mystery cult practice stuff too. Is there commonality? Is Paul running out into these weird areas where they also have mystery cults? And how do you break through that barrier? You got to walk like a duck and talk like a duck. So it makes me think that he was a great, I became all things to all men, even my gospel. And that's the accusation. I think Galatians 3, I disagree with the mythicists on this. They think it all comes only from vision and scripture. No, dude. He persecuted, whatever that even means in his own letters, because he knew what they taught. And so he had to know something. Anyway, I'm rambling into like I think they're accusing Paul of trying to suck up to men with his gospel. Don't worry about circumcised. And it's a man-pleasing gospel. And anyway, we're getting off track here. But that's my little preaching session on like saying we shouldn't rule out
like every single beat that you hit could be almost a show of its own. There is a lot of things that I have a lot of takes about how Paul, for example, is using the language of mystery cults and what it means and what you can infer from that and stuff like that.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, like, I think there probably was a guy, but on bad days when I wake up and I'm really cranky, I'm a Jesus agnostic.
Right.
On good days, I think, yeah, probably. But as I said, he just happens to be one of the people who disappeared from history. And we have other examples of people like that. Aesop, for example. Was there a guy? We don't know, and like,
Right.
I think classicists are probably mostly agnostic. Or Hippocrates, actually. Like, most people think that Hippocrates existed, but there is so few things that we know about his life. He was probably from Co, right? But all of his biographies are highly fictionalized and stuff like that.
Right.
He was a divine being, though, or he was believed to be a divine being. So, like, I'm such a Jesus minimalist that it almost loses a meaning to say that Jesus existed, because there is so few things that you can actually know about him. So that's my like bone that I would throw to Jesus mythicists, And I think you don't need a historical Jesus to explain Christianity, how it started, and even the particular features. Like the story that Richard Carrier, for example, tells on the historicity of Jesus is possible. I think if this is something that happened, it would be pretty much unprecedented in the ancient world. We don't really have like examples of something like that happening. And when people say that we do, when you actually look at it in detail, you find out that that's not really the case.
Mm-hmm.
But it's entirely possible.
Wow. This has been a hell of a damn live show. We went almost 4 hours, everybody. I mean, I appreciate every single bit of it. Yeah, almost 4 hours.
This is how it tends to go.
Yeah, and you always have lots to say. I always enjoy Camille. I hope people will go and subscribe to your YouTube channel. Yeah, please check him out. There's actually the interview that you and I did.
Yeah, when you hit the live option, their live category, yeah, this is it. They split it now. I don't know why. So the videos that I uploaded, they're just a re-upload of me being on Pine Creek and whatnot. These are the original videos that I do myself. And there is something that I want to say, which I think is kind of exciting. So I'm actually studying classics, like formally at the university. And if everything goes well, then next year I'm going to begin my PhD program, which means that I will no longer have to take courses if I don't want to, which means I'm going to have a lot more time, and I will actually be expected to write papers. So, like, if you are excited about my channel or my other appearances or about what I have to say tonight, we are just getting started. Because some of the things that we've been talking about, I am, starting next year, going to be turning into papers that will actually go through peer review. I have 2 in the process right now. I'm working on one that's relevant to Jesus mythicism, actually with Chrissy Hansen. That's going to be written and published as well. And, sky is the limit.
Camille, I hope people will go subscribe to your YouTube channel, man. Go show you some love. Check you out. You're doing all sorts of fun, cool stuff. Everybody, please, the link is in the description. If you're watching this later and you're not catching this live, go check them out. Support the channels and be on the lookout, because I hope that you and I, can actually get the time to follow up and do many more episodes. You have a lot to say that I think my audience wants to hear. Also, let me give a shout out here to Derek Bennett. Derek just started the YouTube channel and has been working multiple jobs at the same time. And of course, the goal is to eventually monetize, making enough money to be able to possibly do this more often. And he is an avid reader. He reads the scholarship. He's into the experts. He wants to see what they say. Go support his YouTube channel, especially check out the latest, greatest, The Monumental Impact of Ancient Egypt on the Bible. That was a real fun presentation. I was hoping we could have done the presentation on MythVision, but your internet literally lagged so bad. I was like, but we are going to do it. We're going to have to make this happen, Derek.
And by the way, I'm Derek's patron on Patreon.
Oh, you're his?
Yeah, I am. I don't have a Patreon, but I actually like fund some of these channels through there. Joe Schmidt, Majesty of Reason. I think am I currently yours?
You were. If you aren't now, I don't know.
I don't know. I switch it from time to time because I don't have enough money to give like all of them, right? But right now, I think David Litva, definitely. That's like a good one to support because he unlike us, he actually has a working scholar,
right.
And unlike some other people who like teaches at the university and does legitimate research. So he, if you have money, that's a really good way to spend that.
Right.
MythVision, of course. I would say with Majesty of Reason, probably the two best YouTube channels specifically on these kinds of topics at the moment. Like what you've done in the last year, that's just amazing. Like that's everything that I could hope for. Critical scholars that people wouldn't know about. I read a book and next month you have the author of the book that I've just read to talk about it on your channel.
Right.
That's amazing,
Well,
so,
when I die, and that day will come, you guys can really write something and just say, maybe all along he was actually a god. Maybe you can tell people some story. You can, no, but seriously, I'm kicking butt, taking names, and I know it, and I'm happy, and I'm proud of it, and I'm going to keep doing it, and we're going to keep educating people with more stuff. But Derek, tell us about giving you a time to shine here. What's the deal, brother? What's up with the YouTube channel? What's up with the Patreon? You pronounce it differently than me.
Well, the YouTube channel is Atheologica, and I'm covering everything from comparative religion, which is my specialty, to counter-apologetics, where I'm taking aim at apologists and their various arguments for the historicity of the resurrection and whatever else. And I also, as a recovering alcoholic, 4 years sober, I go into a little bit, recovery without God. In my next video, actually, I'm going to discuss that in particular, especially after some recent experiences, helping others and doing what I can to assist others in their new path to sobriety. It's very important to me, and I know, Derek, that you understand that as well. So please subscribe to my channel, support me in whatever way you can. I do have the Patreon as well. If you want to jump on board, and I don't have any tiers or like minimum like a minimum set of payment or whatever, anything like that. I'm open to just provide me with as much or as little as you can to support me in whatever way possible, so that I can keep doing what I'm doing. And then I think that I had a lot of fun putting together the Egyptian origins of the Bible. That one seems to have really taken off. Over 5,000 views on my little channel, which is a big deal for me. And I'd love to present that here on your channel, Derek. And I think that we can do that if we just get the presentation in your hands, and I can join you over the phone like I've done today.
I want to do it. And I always enjoy your presentations. They're fresh. They look great. A lot of people always give positive comments and feedback. And we learn something that we never heard of. So I guess the final plug I would give would just simply be saying, go check out MythVision's Patreon. We're working our butts off. You can help support our guest as well. I highly recommend that. But yeah, if you go check out MythVision's Patreon, I've been launching videos. I had fun with this one the other day with Jordan. Man, he does the weirdest things with the Bible. Just like, goodness, I had fundamentalists commenting going, amen, Derek, with my, because the way he reinterprets stuff. But I got a lot of videos that are down here. And oh, that was that one. I almost played it just to show you when I asked her, like, hey, but you know, someone's going to write a story about her when she's long gone, and they're going to go, maybe she was God all along. Hopefully her body goes missing, because that's part of it. But it's definitely something people might ask. Seriously, that was a compliment, by the way. There's a lot of videos that I've done with John Dominic Crossan, which I did when I was in Florida. Paula Fredrickson, I think I still have 8 or 9 videos I did with her. By the way, I got to pat myself on the back and say, nobody, I mean this, like when I saw her in Boston, she has never interviewed with anyone. She's done lectures at universities, and she's been on the news. She's never done like, here I am at your house with a camera, setting up tripods, sitting across from you going, Paula, we both love studying this stuff. So tell me, how do you think, like, was Jesus apocalyptic? Was Paul? And we just had an amazing time. When we got done, her brain hurt, she said, and she said she had more fun than she thought she was going to have. AJ Levine went to bat for me and making this, like, she's like, I vouch for him. He's good people. And so I'm getting in there. I'm connecting with academics. We need more of this. And I have more trips and ideas planned. We went to Israel. I got so much footage. It's ridiculous that I plan on uploading. It really blew my mind while I was over there, guys, and kind of seeing how Hellenized some of these sites were, separate. And I'm going, oh my gosh, what is going on here? But yeah, I could use your support. If you like what you hear here, support it. You can join as little as $3 a month, and you'll access every video I drop. There are different tiers. If you want different things, if you want to get personal time with me, I do that as well. Like, my time is valuable. I have 3 kids. Camille tried to hit me with he has 2 kids, but he is going to school too. So like, you got a lot of reading and stuff you have to do that is just time consuming, but I do reading as well. I got to give myself some credit, a couple books back there, but yeah, Camille, I can't wait to see what you turn into over the next year or two. And we need to meet in person one day so I can get the real good camera quality and like.
Yeah, you need to fly to Europe. We will, if you come here, we are going to absolutely treat you. So maybe in 5 years, when I'm actual like legit scholar and I have qualifications to talk about this, we can record.
Yeah, let's do it. And Derek, traveling across the states, we were probably, I don't know, 2 hours away. I could have swung through, but that drive sucked, so we didn't swing through. We're going to meet in person sometime. Any final words from you guys?
Yeah, that was entertaining. I didn't sleep very well because my baby is growing teeth, so I was kind of worried about how it's going to go. But yeah, it was a lot of fun. I feel more fresh than when we started, actually. So,
wow, you have energy from that. Good. I've seen you do 8 or 9 hour streams, so I can imagine.
I just want to say home to yours here in Kentucky, Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. None of this happy holidays nonsense. None of these plain red cups from Starbucks, the pit of hell. Merry Christmas. We're putting the Christ back in Christmas here in Kentucky, by God. Now find my channel, Atheological, and subscribe.
When you live in a country that's already very secular, you can absolutely say Merry Christmas because, it's no longer an issue. So Merry Christmas.
It's funny how that works. Yeah. Well, Merry Christmas. You'll be seeing me again soon. I've got some scholars coming on. In fact, we have Jonathan Adler's new book on the origins of Judaism. That's coming up. Goodness gracious. I cannot wait to discuss what case he makes and why, using real evidence, not historiography guesswork, real archaeological evidence to make a strong case that Judaism is far younger than you might suspect. Stay tuned, check out the description, and never forget, we are MythVision.
Duty, 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 duty.